The telephone rang at 10 minutes past 9 on the morning of May 17, 1985, and Oleg Gordievsky answered it with the unhurried calm of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades answering telephones without letting anything register on his face. The call was brief. The voice on the other end spoke in Russian, clipped and administrative, the way Moscow Center always sounded when it wanted to disguise urgency behind bureaucratic routine. He was being recalled to Moscow for consultations. His flight was booked for the following week. He should plan accordingly and inform no one of the reason for his return beyond the official line, that senior leadership wished to discuss the expansion of certain operations. He replaced the receiver gently, sat back in his chair, and looked out the window of his office at the Soviet embassy on Kensington Palace Gardens, where the late spring light was settling over the London plane trees in that particular golden way it did in mid-May, soft and unhurried, as though the city had all the time in the world. He watched 2 pigeons on the opposite roofline, their movements entirely indifferent to borders and ideology and the weight of what had just happened. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and concentrated very carefully on breathing. He was 47 years old. He was the acting KGB resident in London, the senior intelligence officer at one of the most strategically important Soviet outposts in the Western world, responsible for overseeing a network of officers and agents in a country that Moscow viewed with deep institutional suspicion. He was a colonel in the KGB's first chief directorate. He was a man who had risen steadily, purposefully, and with genuine competence through the ranks of one of the most formidable intelligence organizations in human history. And he was also, had been for more than a decade, the single most important intelligence asset that British intelligence had ever run inside the Soviet Union. He was a spy, not the kind the Kremlin celebrated in murals and commemorative stamps. The other kind. The call from Moscow could have meant nothing. Senior officers were recalled for consultations routinely. Files needed reviewing, strategies needed discussing, personalities needed managing in person. There were 100 ordinary reasons a man in his position might be summoned home for a week or 2, and in another life, in a cleaner and less complicated existence, he would have taken the next 7 days to prepare his briefing papers and pack a suitable suitcase and give instructions to his deputy about the smooth running of the station. He would have boarded the Aeroflot flight at Heathrow with the mild tedium of a bureaucrat on a business trip and thought no more of it. But Gordievsky did not have a cleaner or less complicated existence. He had, for reasons that had taken years to fully understand and could never be fully explained to anyone outside his own conscience, chosen the most dangerous possible version of this life. He had chosen to carry 2 identities, 2 loyalties, and 2 sets of professional obligations simultaneously, in an environment where discovery meant not dismissal but death. And so when the telephone rang at 10 past 9 on that May morning with the news that Moscow wanted him home, the first thing he felt was not the mild tedium of bureaucratic inconvenience. It was the cold, specific, very familiar dread of a man who understood precisely what discovery inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus looked like. He knew what they did. He had watched it happen to others. The question that occupied the hours and then the days between that telephone call and his flight was a question with no clean answer, because there was no way to know with certainty, not from London, not from the information available to him, whether this was routine or whether this was the beginning of the end. He had lived with ambiguity his entire double life. He had learned to compartmentalize fear, to function normally under pressures that would have paralyzed a less trained mind, to sit across a table from KGB colleagues discussing operational security while carrying in his head a catalogue of what he had already told the British. He was practiced at this. He had been practiced at it for a very long time. But something about this call felt different from the administrative summons he had received before. It was something he could not articulate easily, not a specific word or inflection he could point to, more the quality of silence at the edges of the conversation, the particular efficiency with which the caller had moved past pleasantries, the slight absence of ordinary collegial warmth that usually softened even official communications between officers who knew each other. He turned the conversation over in his mind throughout the following days with the obsessive precision of a codebreaker examining a message that might or might not be significant, and the more he examined it, the less certain he became about what it meant. He told his British handlers. This was not a decision that required lengthy deliberation. It was the kind of thing you told your handlers immediately. He made his way to a prearranged contact meeting in the days that followed, using the practiced counter-surveillance routines he had developed over years of operating in London, doubling back through side streets, stopping at shops with reflective windows, maintaining the natural unhurried pace of a man with nowhere particular to be. The MI6 officers who met him were calm and professional, as they always were, and they listened with the attentive stillness of people who understood that hysteria in a situation like this helped no one. They could not tell him definitively whether the summons was routine. They did not have intelligence to that effect. What they could tell him was that the extraction plan they had discussed, the contingency they had kept in reserve throughout his years as their most prized source, remained available to him. There was a signal he could activate when and if the situation demanded it. He knew the signal. He had always known it. He flew to Moscow the following week. The most valuable British intelligence asset inside the Soviet Union. A KGB colonel who had been feeding secrets to MI6 for over a decade. A phone call from Moscow that could mean nothing or could mean everything. And a man sitting alone in his office on Kensington Palace Gardens, hands flat on the desk, concentrating very carefully on breathing. If the tension of that moment has you in its grip, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications. What Gordievsky did next and how British intelligence got him out is one of the most extraordinary escape operations the Cold War ever produced. The Aeroflot aircraft lifted off Heathrow's runway on a gray morning with the mechanical indifference of a machine that had made this crossing thousands of times. The London skyline receding below him through the cloud until there was nothing but cloud, and then above the cloud a brilliant cold blue sky that belonged to no nation in particular. He sat in his assigned seat and looked out the window and thought about the city disappearing beneath him. He thought about his daughters, Maria and Anna, both very young, who were in Moscow with their mother and who had no knowledge of the extraordinary double life their father had constructed around them. He thought about the officers at MI6 who had guided and protected and valued him for over a decade, people whose calm professionalism had become a kind of anchor across the chaos of his hidden existence. He thought about whether he would ever see any of them again. He arrived in Moscow on a mild afternoon, the air carrying that particular quality Moscow air had in late May, something between the last cold of receding winter and the first real warmth of the coming summer, a kind of seasonal hesitation that matched something in the atmosphere around him as he walked through the arrivals hall and collected his luggage and moved toward the exit with the precisely calibrated normality he had spent decades practicing. Nothing about his bearing or expression indicated anything beyond the professional composure of a senior officer returning from a long posting. No one arrested him at the airport. He took a taxi to his Moscow apartment. He unpacked. He made telephone calls to family members. He reported to KGB headquarters at Yasenevo, the vast complex in the woods southwest of the city that housed the first chief directorate, and he was received by colleagues who greeted him with ordinary institutional warmth, handshakes and questions about London, and the usual mild curiosity that returned officers attracted from those who had stayed behind. Everything seemed normal, or something was performing normality with enough skill that he could not see clearly behind it. Either possibility was consistent with what he observed, and not being able to tell the difference between them was its own particular form of torment. He had been betrayed. He did not know it yet, but in a CIA conference room thousands of miles away, a Soviet intelligence officer named Aldrich Ames had already provided Moscow Center with information that pointed directly at him. The machinery of Soviet counterintelligence, patient and methodical and deeply experienced in the management of its suspicions, had already begun to move. The question was not whether Gordievsky had been identified. The question was how long the KGB would wait before acting. To understand how a man arrived at this moment, standing in a Moscow apartment in the last weeks of his double life with the weight of everything he had done pressing down on him, you have to go back much further than 1985. You have to go back to a small apartment in Moscow during the years of Stalin, to a household shaped by the institutional culture of Soviet intelligence, to a boy growing up inside the machinery of the state and learning very slowly, over the course of decades, that the machinery he had been raised to serve was built on lies. The story of Oleg Gordievsky begins not with a betrayal, but with a belief. A belief held sincerely, and with the particular intensity that only a childhood soaked in ideology can produce, before the evidence of the world began, piece by piece, to make that belief impossible to sustain. Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky was born on the 10th of February 1938, in Moscow, into a family so thoroughly embedded in the structures of Soviet power that the state was not simply the backdrop of his childhood but its very architecture. His father, Anton Lavrentievich Gordievsky, was an officer of the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the brutal and expansive security apparatus that preceded the KGB and that had, in the years immediately before Oleg's birth, been at the center of the most savage political terror the Soviet Union had yet visited upon itself. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, had reshaped the Communist Party from top to bottom, had sent millions to the labor camps of the Gulag, and had been administered in its most intimate details by men very much like Anton Gordievsky. This is not to say that Anton Gordievsky was a monster in any simple sense, or that a childhood in a household touched by the NKVD constituted a childhood in horror. The reality was considerably more complicated and, in its own way, more instructive. Anton was a loyal officer of the Soviet state, a man who had given his professional life to the security of the revolution, and who had survived the purges not by accident but through the practiced art of institutional compliance, the ability to read the political temperature with enough accuracy to remain on the correct side of whatever line was currently being drawn. He had witnessed colleagues denounced and arrested and in some cases shot. He had participated, in whatever capacity his role required, in the machinery of state violence that made the Soviet Union function in the way that it did. And he had returned home to his family each evening and been, by all accounts, a relatively ordinary father. This was the peculiar moral landscape of Stalinist Moscow. The men who administered the terror were not, in the main, visibly different from the men who suffered it. They lived in the same communal apartments, rode the same overcrowded trams, worried about food shortages and school examinations and the health of elderly parents. The vast and violent apparatus of the Soviet state was not experienced by those inside it as something alien and imposed, but as the normal texture of professional life, the bureaucratic reality that employed you and housed you and educated your children and eventually, if the wind changed, might destroy you. Everyone lived inside it. The question was only what you did with that knowledge. Oleg was the younger of two sons. His brother Vasily was born a few years earlier, and like Oleg would ultimately follow his father into Soviet intelligence, though with a sharper ideological commitment, a truer believer in the state and its mission. The two brothers would in time come to represent two genuinely divergent responses to exactly the same upbringing, which is itself worth dwelling on, because it suggests that the path Oleg eventually chose was not determined by his circumstances but by something more interior, some quality of attention or sensitivity that made him alert to what his brother was able to tolerate without noticing. The family's apartment was in Moscow, and the city that Oleg grew up in during the late 1930s and 1940s was a city defined by its contrasts. The grand Stalinist architecture that lined the main avenues, those enormous neoclassical buildings with their ornate facades and grandiose proportions designed to communicate the permanence and authority of the socialist project, existed alongside the cramped communal living conditions that most ordinary families endured, multiple families sharing a single kitchen, a single bathroom, the constant negotiation of proximity without privacy. It was a city of victory parades and food rations, of celebrated scientists and denounced intellectuals, of art and music and ballet culture alongside an informer network so pervasive that you learned very early which conversations could be held in public and which required a lowered voice and a glance at the door. The Second World War, which Soviet history and Soviet memory would codify as the Great Patriotic War, shaped Oleg's early childhood in ways that shaped everyone's childhood in the Soviet Union during those years. The German invasion of June 1941, when Oleg was 3 years old, began a conflict of staggering scale and brutality that would ultimately kill somewhere between 26 and 27 million Soviet citizens, a figure so large that it resists ordinary comprehension. The war pervaded everything in the years of Oleg's early formation, from the food shortages to the rhetoric on the radio to the absences in families where fathers and brothers had gone to the front. It produced, in many Soviet citizens, a genuine and deeply felt patriotism, a love of country forged in suffering and sacrifice that was entirely real regardless of what one thought about the political system that governed the country. Oleg would absorb this patriotism along with everything else. It was not something he would ever entirely lose. What changed over the years was not his love for Russia but his relationship to the particular version of Russia the Communist Party had constructed. This was a slow erosion, the kind that does not announce itself all at once but accumulates through a series of small perceptions, each individually dismissible, collectively impossible to ignore. It began with things he noticed as a child and adolescent, small discrepancies between what the state proclaimed and what the lived reality of people around him suggested. The rhetoric of abundance and the evidence of shortage. The language of freedom and the fact of restriction. The celebration of collective solidarity and the constant undercurrent of fear that ran beneath every ordinary interaction when politics was involved. His entrance into Soviet intellectual life came through the Moscow Institute of International Relations, where he enrolled as a student in the mid-1950s. The institute, known by its Russian initialism GIMO, was one of the most selective and prestigious academic institutions in the Soviet Union, the training ground for diplomats, foreign ministry officials, and intelligence officers, a place where the Soviet state sent the young men it had identified as possessing the skills and dispositions required for its most sensitive foreign engagements. The curriculum included intensive language study, and Gordievsky would graduate with strong English and German, the latter particularly important given the geopolitical significance of divided Germany in the Cold War framework. He would also develop a genuine and lasting love for Western classical music and literature, a private cultivation of the cultural life of the societies he was being trained to observe and in some respects to subvert. It was at MGIMO that Gordievsky encountered the peer community that would shape his adult professional identity, bright, linguistically gifted, politically aware young men from families with NKVD or KGB connections, many of them marked from an early age for careers in intelligence. The atmosphere combined genuine intellectual rigor with ideological conformity, and the balance between the two shifted depending on who was teaching, what was being discussed, and how the political climate was running at any particular moment. Khrushchev had already delivered his secret speech by the time Gordievsky was studying there, the extraordinary 1956 address to the 20th Party Congress in which the Soviet premier had acknowledged, in partially obscured but unmistakable terms, some of the crimes of the Stalin era. The speech had sent shockwaves through the Soviet intellectual establishment, creating a complicated atmosphere in which more open discussion of the recent past became briefly possible while the structural realities of one-party rule remained entirely intact. For Gordievsky, the secret speech was one of the early data points in a slowly accumulating picture. Here was the state, through its own highest representative, acknowledging that the terror had been real, that the executions and the purges had been genuine rather than the just punishment of genuine enemies, that the system had consumed its own people with a ferocity that demanded some accounting. And yet the accounting offered was fragmentary, defensive, carefully bounded to prevent any scrutiny that might reach too far into the present. It was a partial truth deployed to serve political purposes rather than a genuine reckoning. Gordievsky noticed this, stored it. He was that kind of man. He graduated and was recruited into the KGB's first chief directorate, the foreign intelligence arm responsible for the Soviet Union's espionage operations abroad. This was the elite branch, the one that sent officers to Western cities under diplomatic cover, that recruited foreign nationals as agents, that stole secrets from governments and defense establishments and scientific institutions across the non-communist world. It was, in the language of the Cold War, the sharp end of the Soviet intelligence apparatus, and getting there required precisely the backgrounds and aptitudes that Gordievsky had accumulated across his life up to that point. The languages, the family connections, the MGIMO credential, the demonstrated capacity to operate in complex social environments with composure and analytical intelligence. He underwent the standard training for first chief directorate officers, a rigorous preparation in tradecraft, foreign cultures, agent handling, and the finer arts of intelligence collection. He learned surveillance techniques and counter-surveillance, the construction of cover identities, the methods for establishing and maintaining contact with recruited agents, the protocols for communicating securely across hostile environments. He was taught how to read people, how to identify and cultivate potential sources, how to create the conditions in which a foreign national might be persuaded that cooperating with Soviet intelligence served their interests or their conscience or both. He was, in other words, trained in exactly the skills he would one day deploy in reverse. His first foreign posting came in 1966, to Copenhagen. Denmark was not the most glamorous of assignments in the KGB's global network of residentiaries, nothing like the high-pressure intensity of the London or Washington or Paris stations, but Copenhagen had its own strategic significance, positioned at the edge of Scandinavia, adjacent to the NATO northern flank, close enough to the interests of the Baltic that it mattered to Moscow in ways that were not always obvious from the outside. Gordievsky arrived in Denmark with the rank of third secretary at the Soviet embassy, the standard diplomatic cover for an intelligence officer at his career stage, and he settled into the work of building his network and observing the society around him with the methodical professionalism of a man doing his job. What he found in Denmark was something his Soviet upbringing had not fully prepared him for. He found a functioning, imperfect, untidy, quietly prosperous democracy, a society in which people disagreed publicly about matters of policy without being arrested for it, in which a free press reported on government failures without being shut down, in which ordinary citizens went about their lives with a latitude of personal freedom that the Soviet system would have regarded as incompatible with social order. He found a country where the gap between official rhetoric and observable reality was nothing like the chasm he had grown up navigating. The dissonance between what the Soviet state had told him about the West and what he could observe with his own eyes in the streets and cafes and bookshops of Copenhagen began to widen, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed. He was not yet ready to act on this dissonance. He was still, in the mid-1960s, more the product of his formation than the agent of his own future. But the seeds of what would eventually flower into one of the most consequential acts of individual moral decision in the entire Cold War were already in the ground, waiting for a catalyst that would provide the necessary heat. That catalyst was coming. And when it arrived, in the form of Soviet tanks rumbling through the streets of a European capital city, it would change everything. The summer of 1968 was one of those historical moments that folded time, that separated the world into a before and an after so sharply that the people living through it could feel the crease forming under their feet. In Paris, students and workers had paralyzed the city through weeks of sustained protest, challenging not just a government but the entire moral and political architecture of post-war Western society. In the United States, Martin Luther King had been shot dead in April and Robert Kennedy in June, and the convulsions of grief and rage that followed had served notice that the most powerful nation on earth was in the grip of something it could not easily name. Everywhere you looked in 1968, the certainties that had structured the previous generation's understanding of how the world worked were coming under a pressure they had not anticipated. And in Czechoslovakia, in a city of bridges and Baroque spires that had seen more than its share of historical fracture points, something was happening that would matter more than most people realized at the time, and that would matter to Oleg Gordievsky in ways that nothing else in his life would quite replicate. The Prague Spring had begun in January 1968 when Alexander Dubček replaced Antonin Novotny as first secretary of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. Dubček was a communist, a genuine one, but he was the kind of communist who believed in the proposition that socialism could be made compatible with political openness, that the party could hold power without requiring the total suppression of everything outside its control. He spoke of socialism with a human face, a phrase that sounded modest and even obvious to Western ears but that represented, in the context of the Soviet bloc, something approaching a revolutionary manifesto. Under Dubček, censorship was relaxed. The press began to report freely. Political prisoners were rehabilitated. Citizens were permitted to form organizations outside the party's direct control. The specific oppressions of Stalinist rule began to loosen their grip, and in the space created by that loosening, Czech and Slovak society breathed with an energy and creative vitality that astonished observers from both sides of the Cold War divide. Gordievsky was in Copenhagen when the Prague Spring unfolded, following the events in Czechoslovakia through the international press and through the intelligence traffic that passed through the Soviet embassy. He watched what was happening with a particular quality of attention, because what was happening in Prague was a direct challenge to the proposition that had been offered to him his entire life, the idea that the Soviet model was the only valid model for socialist governance, that any deviation from the form of communism practiced in Moscow was either naive or counter-revolutionary. Here was a communist-led government in a Warsaw Pact country attempting, deliberately and in good faith, to demonstrate that the Soviet form was not the only possible form, that you could have socialism without the apparatus of total control. He found the argument compelling. He found the experiment genuinely exciting. Moscow was watching too, and Moscow's reaction was the precise opposite of excitement. The Kremlin under Brezhnev viewed Dubček's reforms with an alarm that was partly strategic, partly ideological, and partly the deeply institutional alarm of a power that understood, at some level it could not fully acknowledge even to itself, that its legitimacy rested on the impossibility of alternatives. If Czechoslovakia succeeded in developing a workable model of socialism that preserved genuine political freedoms, then the question of why similar freedoms could not exist in the Soviet Union itself became impossible to suppress. The Prague Spring was threatening not just because of what it was, but because of what it implied. The debate within the Soviet leadership during the summer of 1968 was not, by the available historical accounts, a simple or unanimous one. There were voices within the Politburo and among senior military and intelligence officials who counseled patience, who argued that intervention would damage Soviet prestige internationally and that Dubček could be managed through political pressure rather than force. There were those who believed the reforms could be constrained short of the point at which they became genuinely dangerous. But the dominant view, the one that ultimately prevailed, was the view associated most closely with Brezhnev himself and with the hardliners around him, who argued that allowing Czechoslovakia to proceed on its current course risked a contagion that the Soviet bloc could not absorb. The lesson they had drawn from Hungary in 1956, where a similar experiment in liberalization had been crushed by Soviet tanks with complete military effectiveness but at significant political cost, was that intervention worked. The empire held when force was applied. You could weather the condemnations. On the night of the 20th to the 21st of August 1968, Warsaw Pact forces crossed into Czechoslovakia. The invasion involved approximately 500,000 soldiers and 5,000 tanks, drawn from the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and East Germany, an overwhelming application of military power against a country that had offered no military provocation whatsoever against any of its neighbors. The Czechoslovak government was not at war. It was not threatening anyone. It had not repudiated its commitments to the Warsaw Pact. It had simply been attempting to govern its own citizens in a manner slightly more consistent with their expressed wishes and considerably more consistent with their dignity. For this, Brezhnev sent 5,000 tanks. Gordievsky followed the news in Copenhagen with a reaction he later described with remarkable precision in his memoirs. He was devastated, not confused, not conflicted, not reassessing a complicated geopolitical situation with appropriate nuance. He was morally devastated, as someone is when a belief they have held with genuine conviction is revealed, not by argument but by observable fact, to be indefensible. The Soviet Union had invaded a peaceful neighboring country, a fellow socialist state, and crushed a democratic reform movement with military force because it regarded the existence of democratic options within its sphere as an existential threat. There was no interpretation of this action that could reconcile it with the political values that Soviet education and Soviet ideology had claimed to represent. He was not alone in this reaction. The Prague Spring and its violent suppression produced a profound crisis among Western communist parties and among a generation of left-leaning intellectuals who had maintained, sometimes in the face of considerable contrary evidence, some version of a belief in the redemptive potential of the Soviet project. The Italian and French communist parties issued statements of condemnation. Intellectuals who had previously been sympathetic to Moscow distanced themselves with varying degrees of public anguish. The specific moral authority that the Soviet Union had derived from its role in defeating fascism, an authority that had survived the revelations of Khrushchev's secret speech and the memory of the Hungarian suppression of 1956, took a blow in August 1968 from which it would never fully recover in educated Western opinion. For Gordievsky, the blow was more personal, more complete, and more structurally significant than it was for a left-wing intellectual in Paris or Rome, because he was not simply a sympathizer in the West reconsidering his political sympathies. He was a KGB officer who had been trained by the Soviet state, who owed his professional existence to the Soviet state, who lived inside the institutional apparatus of the Soviet state and understood its workings from the inside. He could not distance himself from this event the way a Western observer could. He was, in a meaningful sense, part of the machine that had sent the tanks. And the weight of that complicity, the impossibility of standing apart from what his country and his employer had just done, settled on him in an August that was warm and sunny in Denmark and nightmarish in Prague. He began reading Western literature and political philosophy with a new and purposeful intensity during this period, supplementing the intellectual life he had already been quietly cultivating in Copenhagen. He read the works of dissidents and critics of the Soviet system, texts that circulated in the West but were unavailable in the Soviet Union, accounts of the Gulag and the purges, analyses of the structural deceptions at the heart of Soviet political culture. He encountered ideas that gave articulate form to the convictions that had been forming in him imprecisely since childhood, the conviction that the gap between Soviet rhetoric and Soviet reality was not a temporary problem to be corrected by better leadership or improved policy, but a fundamental feature of a system built on coercion and sustained by the suppression of truth. He also began, during this period, to think differently about his work. He was still a KGB officer. He was still doing his job, reporting on Danish political life, maintaining his cover, going through the professional motions of Soviet foreign intelligence work. But something had shifted in his relationship to the work, the quiet and unacknowledged shift that happens when you continue performing actions whose underlying justification you no longer believe. He was collecting intelligence for a state he had concluded was morally indefensible. He was protecting secrets for a government that had demonstrated in August 1968 that it would crush any movement toward human dignity within its sphere of influence with tanks and soldiers and the entire weight of its military might. He did not yet know what to do about this recognition. The step between acknowledging privately that a government is wrong and actively working against it is an enormous one, across which most people never pass, because the practical risks are prohibitive and the psychological demands are extraordinary. But Gordievsky had moved, in the summer of 1968, from the territory of doubt into the territory of conviction. The question was only whether conviction would eventually become action, and what form that action might take. He was returned to Moscow in 1970, at the end of his first Copenhagen tour, and spent 2 years back at Yasenevo in the analytical and operational roles that the first chief directorate assigned to officers between foreign postings. He was, by all outward appearances, a competent and committed Soviet intelligence officer, methodical in his work, collegial in his relationships, devoted to the technical demands of his profession. He attended the required meetings and wrote the required reports and participated in the institutional life of an organization he was beginning, very carefully, to think of differently. He was given a second Copenhagen posting in 1972. He boarded the flight for Denmark with his suitcase and his cover documents and, somewhere less visible than either, the accumulating weight of a decision that was not yet fully formed but was moving, slowly and irrevocably, toward becoming one. The second Copenhagen posting had a different quality to it from the first. The city was the same, the canals still catching the particular Nordic light that made everything look slightly as though it had been carefully composed rather than simply existing, the cycling culture and the red brick civic architecture and the effortless civility of Danish daily life all as he remembered it from the late 1960s. But Gordievsky arrived in 1972 as a different man than the one who had left in 1970. Carrying a private understanding of the Soviet system that the 2 years in Moscow had done nothing to soften. If anything, the return to headquarters had sharpened his perception of the institutional culture he was embedded in, had made visible in the bureaucratic routines and political posturing of Yasenevo the same essential dishonesty he had observed on a world historical scale in August 1968. He had spent 2 years watching colleagues who knew perfectly well that the intelligence they were producing was being shaped to confirm what the Politburo wanted to hear, watching the subtle but unmistakable pressures that ensured analysis conformed to ideology rather than the reverse, and he had stored all of it with the patient precision of someone who was not yet sure what they were going to do with what they were learning, but who understood that it warranted careful attention. Denmark in the 1970s was an interesting landscape for a Soviet intelligence officer with his particular frame of mind. The country was a NATO member, and the Soviet intelligence apparatus in Copenhagen devoted considerable effort to mapping Danish military installations, monitoring NATO communications that passed through Danish channels, and maintaining contact with sources across Scandinavian political and academic life. Gordievsky performed these duties with his usual professional competence. He was good at his work, he had always been good at it, and the contradiction between professional excellence and private conviction was one he managed with the same compartmentalized precision that the KGB had spent years training him to apply to entirely different problems. But the private life he was building alongside the professional one had begun to pull in a direction that could not be sustained indefinitely. He was attending concerts, reading widely in Western political philosophy and literature, forming genuine friendships with Danes and with members of the Western diplomatic community in Copenhagen whose company his cover role as a Soviet embassy official provided legitimate access to. These relationships and cultural immersions were not, it should be noted, cover. They were real. The music mattered to him, the literature mattered, the conversations with people who lived inside systems that permitted genuine political disagreement and free expression of thought mattered in a way that the social interactions of his professional KGB life never quite did. He was a man with a double interior life long before he had a double professional one, someone who had learned, from a very early age in a society that demanded it, to keep the private and the public carefully separated. The British Secret Intelligence Service had a presence in Copenhagen, as it had in every Western capital, and the intelligence affairs of Denmark were managed from an SIS station operating under standard diplomatic cover. The SIS had an interest in the Soviet embassy and its personnel, as all Western intelligence services did in any city where the USSR maintained a significant presence. Officers were watched, assessed, their vulnerabilities and potential motivations catalogued with the methodical patience of organizations that understood that a single well-placed asset inside Soviet intelligence was worth more than any number of conventional intelligence operations. The SIS was always watching. It was simply a question of who was worth watching most carefully. Exactly how the initial contact between Gordievsky and British intelligence was established is something that neither Gordievsky nor the British government has ever fully disclosed, for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The methods and tradecraft of agent recruitment are closely held secrets, and the protection of sources and methods that remain operationally relevant extends well beyond any individual case. What can be said, drawing on Gordievsky's own published account and the substantial body of responsible journalism and historical scholarship that has accumulated around his story, is that the approach was gradual rather than sudden, a careful process of mutual assessment spread across a period of time in which both parties were establishing, with appropriate caution, that the other was what they appeared to be. For the SIS, the question was whether a Soviet KGB officer who appeared to be developing sympathies with the West was genuine or whether this was a provocation, a KGB officer deliberately offering himself as an asset in order to feed disinformation into the Western intelligence stream. This was not a theoretical concern. The KGB had run provocations of exactly this type before with considerable success. The history of Cold War intelligence was littered with embarrassing cases of Western services who had believed they were running a valuable penetration of Soviet intelligence and had in fact been brilliantly manipulated throughout. The SIS had its own painful experience of this, courtesy of decades of Soviet penetration at the highest levels of British intelligence. These lessons created a professional culture that was properly skeptical, that assessed potential assets against rigorous criteria, and that required a level of demonstrated bona fides before extending real trust. For Gordievsky, the question was even starker. He was not theorizing about recruitment. He was contemplating an act that was, under Soviet law, treasonous in the most capital sense of the word, an act that if discovered would mean not merely professional ruin but execution. The Soviet state reserved its most extreme penalties for officers who betrayed state secrets to foreign intelligence services, and the rationale for this was obvious and brutal. The disclosure of KGB operations and personnel to Western intelligence services was, from the perspective of the Soviet state, an act of war conducted from within. Gordievsky understood this with the precise institutional knowledge of a man who worked in the organization that would do the finding and the punishing. He understood what happened to those who were caught. What drove him across the threshold despite this understanding was, he has explained in various forms over the years, a compound of the moral conviction that had been growing in him since Prague 1968 and a more personal and specific determination to do something with that conviction beyond simply carrying it privately as a kind of internal protest that changed nothing in the world. He had concluded that the Soviet system was not reformable from within, that it was not a project to which further loyalty was justified, and that the most meaningful form of opposition available to a man in his specific position was not resignation or public dissent, both of which were impossible, but cooperation with the Western intelligence services that were engaged in the containing and confronting of Soviet power from the outside. He was not defecting in any simple sense. He was not asking to leave the Soviet Union and settle in the West. He was offering to remain in place, to continue doing his KGB job, while simultaneously reporting what he knew and what he learned to the British. This distinction matters enormously. A defector walks away. An agent in place stays. And an agent in place of Gordievsky's quality, a trained KGB officer operating under legitimate diplomatic cover with direct access to Soviet intelligence operations and priorities and methods, represented something of an entirely different order of value to British intelligence than a defector who walked out with whatever he happened to know at the moment of his departure. The SIS understood this perfectly. When the preliminary assessments had been completed and the bona fides established to a sufficient level of satisfaction, and when it was determined that Gordievsky was what he appeared to be, and that his motivations were what he described them to be, the relationship was formalized in the terms that the intelligence world uses for such arrangements. He was given a code name. British intelligence would know him as Sunbeam. The tradecraft surrounding the new relationship was developed with the careful professionalism that the situation required. Dead drops, prearranged meeting locations, signals and countersignals, the entire operational vocabulary of clandestine communication, all of it had to be established and practiced and maintained with the precision that the difference between operational security and disaster demanded. Gordievsky was already well trained in these techniques. He had, after all, been trained by one of the world's foremost intelligence services. The irony that he was now applying KGB tradecraft methodology in the service of countering the KGB was not lost on him, and he has noted it with a characteristic dryness in his accounts of this period. The early intelligence he provided was sufficient to establish that he was genuine and that his knowledge was real and current. He had access to information about KGB personnel in Copenhagen, about the station's operations against Danish targets, about the communication methods and reporting structures of the Residentia. He knew the identities of officers whose diplomatic cover had not been blown. He knew the targets the station was pursuing and the methods it was using. This material was valuable in its own right, but in the larger context of what Sunbeam could potentially provide over a longer career of intelligence cooperation, it was the opening chapter of what the SIS already understood might become a very significant story. The relationship required Gordievsky to maintain absolute normality in his KGB professional life, to give no indication to any colleague or supervisor that anything had changed in his outlook or his activities, to continue performing his Soviet intelligence functions with the same apparent commitment and competence he had always demonstrated. This was psychologically demanding in ways that are difficult to communicate to anyone who has not experienced the sustained performance of a false identity over years rather than hours. Every meeting with a KGB colleague, every operational discussion, every social occasion with Soviet embassy staff required the conscious management of a presentation that concealed his true situation entirely. One slip, one moment of unguarded honesty, one detail out of place, could unravel everything. He managed it. He had been managing divided interior lives since childhood, since the days when he had learned that certain thoughts were not appropriate for public expression in the Soviet Union, that the gap between what you thought and what you said was a survival skill rather than a moral failure. He simply applied that skill to a new and higher stakes context, and did so with the same composed attention to detail that characterized everything else he did professionally. The second Copenhagen posting ended in 1978, and Gordievsky returned to Moscow once more. He had been Sunbeam for several years by now, and the intelligence relationship with the British had developed and deepened across that time. The return to Moscow did not terminate the relationship. It paused some operational elements of it while maintaining others through the communication channels that had been established. and it set the stage for what would prove to be the most operationally consequential phase of his extraordinary double career, waiting for the next posting that would give him the access to make everything that had come before look like preliminary work. The years between 1978 and 1982, the period Gordievsky spent back in Moscow between his second Copenhagen tour and his eventual London posting, were in some respects the most taxing of his double life, though not in the ways that an outsider might expect. He was not under direct suspicion during this time. The KGB's Counterintelligence Directorate, the second chief directorate responsible for monitoring its own officers, had no active case against him. He went to work at Yasenevo each day and performed his analytical and operational duties with the professional competence that had characterized his career from the beginning, and his colleagues and superiors saw nothing that gave them pause. The difficulty was more private and more corrosive than external surveillance, and it had to do with the particular psychological burden of living inside institutions whose inner workings you know with precision and whose values you have decisively rejected. He was involved during this period in work connected to the KGB's operations in Britain, a posting which, with the perspective afforded by later events, reads as a long preparation for what was coming. He worked on files related to British targets, studied the operational landscape of the United Kingdom, contributed to the analytical work that fed into the first Chief Directorate's understanding of British political and intelligence affairs. He was building, almost unknowingly, the expertise that would make him extraordinarily valuable when the London posting finally came. He continued to maintain communication with his British handlers through whatever channels the pause in direct overseas contact permitted, keeping the relationship alive across the geographical separation with the care of a man who understood that the relationship was the most important thing he had constructed in his professional life. His personal life during this period was marked by the end of his first marriage and the beginning of his second. He had married Yelena Akopian in 1968, but the marriage had not survived the pressures of his complicated existence, the long separations of foreign postings, the fundamental impossibility of being genuinely known by a partner when the most significant truth about yourself is one you cannot share. He married Leila Aliyeva, a younger woman, in 1979, and they would have 2 daughters together, Maria and Anna, born in the early 1980s. Gordievsky has written about these relationships with the awareness that his years of double agency constituted, among everything else, a sustained and unresolvable deception of the people closest to him. Leila knew that her husband was a KGB officer. She did not know the other half of what he was. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the international environment that gave his intelligence work its significance was growing considerably darker. The relative détente of the Nixon and Ford years, the period of arms limitation treaties and rhetorical moderation that had characterized superpower relations in the early and middle 1970s, was unraveling under a combination of pressures that neither side had managed well. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 had ended any remaining American inclination toward accommodation, and the Carter administration's decision to boycott the Moscow Olympics and resume grain embargo politics was followed, in January 1981, by the arrival in the White House of Ronald Reagan, a president whose rhetoric about the Soviet Union was more confrontational than anything Moscow had heard from an American president since the early Cold War. Reagan's language was not diplomatic. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed missile defense system that Moscow understood, with some reason, as a potential attempt to neutralize the Soviet nuclear deterrent and thereby alter the fundamental strategic balance of the Cold War. The temperature between the superpowers was rising steadily, and the intelligence services on both sides were working harder in this environment, not less. The London posting came through in 1982. Gordievsky was assigned to the KGB Residentia at the Soviet Embassy in Kensington, operating under his standard diplomatic cover, and he arrived in the city he would later describe as having felt, from his first encounter with it, like a second home. London was not Copenhagen. It was larger, denser, more historically layered, a city whose sense of its own past was present everywhere, in the architecture and the institutions and the slightly formal modulations of social interaction that distinguished the English from the Danes. But it was a Western city, a free city, and after the years in Moscow it felt to him like the resumption of something that the return to the Soviet capital had interrupted. He re-established contact with his British handlers almost immediately. The SIS had not been idle in the period of Gordievsky's Moscow posting, and the renewed operational relationship picked up with a fluency that reflected how carefully both sides had maintained it across the gap. The intelligence community in Britain had already benefited substantially from what Sunbeam had produced in Copenhagen, and with the London posting, the potential for significantly more important material had arrived. He was now operating inside one of the most significant Soviet intelligence operations in the Western world, with access not just to the specific targets and methods of the London Residentia but to the broader strategic picture of what the KGB's first chief directorate was attempting to accomplish in the United Kingdom and across the Western Alliance more generally. What he was able to provide was not limited to operational details of individual cases, though those were valuable enough on their own terms, allowing the SIS and its partner agencies to run interference against specific Soviet intelligence operations and to identify KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover whose identities had not been previously established. Beyond the tactical, he was providing strategic intelligence of the first order, insight into how the Soviet leadership was thinking, what it feared, what it intended, what assumptions it was making about Western intentions and capabilities. This kind of intelligence is in some respects more important than intelligence about specific operations, because it informs the most fundamental calculations that governments and their defense establishments make about the nature of the threat they are facing and therefore about what measures are appropriate in response. The reach of what Gordievsky provided had long since extended beyond the SIS to encompass the agencies of Britain's closest allies. The intelligence relationship between Britain and the United States meant that material from Sunbeam was reaching the CIA and, through the CIA, the highest levels of the American government, including the National Security Council and the Office of the President. This was material assessed at a level of seriousness commensurate with its source, which was understood within the intelligence community to be exceptional even by the exacting standards of senior penetrations. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was briefed on Gordievsky's intelligence in terms that did not identify him but conveyed the substance and the significance of what he was producing. She took it seriously, used it in her assessments of Soviet intentions, and understood from it things about the nature of Soviet thinking that would not have been available to her through any other means. The intelligence was particularly significant in one critical area. Gordievsky was reporting on the KGB's analysis of Western intentions regarding nuclear weapons, and specifically on an alarming shift in Soviet strategic thinking that had profound implications for the stability of the entire Cold War standoff. The KGB had assessed and was reporting to the Soviet leadership that the United States was preparing, or at least seriously contemplating, a nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. This assessment was not an aberration or the product of an individual analyst's overheated imagination. It had been institutionalized in a formal intelligence collection program, launched in 1981, called Operation Ryan, and it reflected a genuine and widening conviction at the highest levels of Soviet military and political leadership that the combination of Reagan's confrontational rhetoric, the deployment of new American nuclear systems in Europe, and what the KGB interpreted as the aggressive posture of the new American administration represented a real and immediate threat. Understanding that the Soviet leadership genuinely believed this, rather than simply using the threat of Western aggression as political propaganda for domestic consumption, required exactly the kind of inside access that only a deeply embedded source could provide. Gordievsky provided it. He explained, with the specificity that comes from first-hand knowledge of how the assessment had been developed and what evidence was being used to support it, that the Kremlin's fear was real, that Operation Ryan was a genuine operational program, and that the KGB was actively tasking its residentias in Western capitals to look for indicators of impending nuclear attack. The indicators they were looking for included, according to Gordievsky's reporting, things like unusual patterns in blood bank usage, purchases of food by government officials, increased activity at military installations, and changes in the lighting patterns at American and British government buildings. The KGB had essentially told its officers to watch for signs of war preparation, and those officers were dutifully watching. The significance of this reached beyond the purely intelligence dimension. If the Soviet leadership was in a state of genuine strategic anxiety about the possibility of a Western first strike, Then any Western military activity, however routine, that could be misinterpreted as preparation for attack had the potential to trigger a response. This was not theoretical. The Cold War had a history of close calls that had only later become known, moments when misunderstandings or technical failures had brought the world closer to nuclear exchange than the public had any awareness of. The knowledge that the Soviet Union was in a heightened state of alert, actively looking for signs of Western military preparation through a formal intelligence collection apparatus, was information of the most profound strategic importance. It meant that standard NATO military exercises and routine movements of nuclear forces, activities that Western governments regarded as entirely defensive in character, were being watched and assessed by Soviet intelligence in a context of profound and genuine fear. The briefings that Gordievsky provided to his SIS handlers during the early years of the London posting gave British intelligence and, through British intelligence, their American partners a window into this Soviet anxiety that would prove crucial in the months ahead. The world was about to have a very close call, one that would only become fully understood from the Western side through the intelligence that Sunbeam was producing, and in the autumn of 1983 the fragile equilibrium of the Cold War standoff would be tested in a way that not enough people in the years since have fully appreciated. The daily reality of Gordievsky's double existence in London during the early 1980s was more complex in its practical texture than the word espionage tends to suggest. Popular imagination, shaped by decades of fiction and film, tends to compress the spy's working life into a series of dramatic encounters, urgent meetings in darkened locations, the swift passing of envelopes and the exchange of passwords. The truth of sustained long-term agent handling, particularly of an asset of Gordievsky's seniority and access, was considerably more administrative, more patient, and more psychologically demanding in a quieter and more cumulative way. His meetings with SIS handlers in London were conducted under the protocols that the intelligence service had developed for precisely this kind of sensitive operation. They met in locations arranged through the tradecraft signals that had been established during the Copenhagen years and refined over the decade of the relationship, ordinary urban locations, parks and public houses, and unremarkable streets across the city, chosen for their operational safety rather than their atmosphere. Counter-surveillance was practiced rigorously on both sides. The handlers who met him were experienced officers who understood the value of what they were running and who brought to those meetings the particular quality of attention that the situation demanded, not just professional competence but a genuine appreciation of the personal circumstances of the man sitting across from them. The relationship between an intelligence service and a long-term agent in place is one of the more unusual professional relationships that exists in any field, because it combines elements of the operational and the personal in ways that ordinary professional partnerships do not. The handlers needed to understand Gordievsky well enough to read his assessments accurately, to know when he was confident and when he was uncertain, to distinguish between what he knew directly and what he was inferring from the material available to him. This required a sustained engagement with him as a person, an understanding of how he thought and what he valued and what pressures were operating on him at any given time. The people who ran Sunbeam over the years developed, by all accounts, a relationship with him that went considerably beyond the merely transactional, and the qualities of trust and mutual regard that this produced were not simply nice features of the operation. They were essential to its functioning. What he was producing during the early London years covered a broad range of the KGB's operations against British targets. He knew the composition of the residentia, the identities of officers operating under diplomatic cover, the specific targets they were pursuing in British government, industry, and political life, and the methods they were using to pursue them. This material allowed British counterintelligence to monitor, and in some cases disrupt Soviet operations without revealing that the disruption derived from an inside source. The art of handling agent intelligence without compromising the agent is itself one of the central craft skills of intelligence work, and the SIS exercised it with considerable sophistication in the handling of Sunbeam's product. Beyond the operational details, Gordievsky was providing the kind of analytical intelligence about Soviet strategic thinking that no other source on the British books was in a position to produce. He had access to the communications and reporting that flowed through the residentia from Moscow Center, to the assessments and tasking that conveyed what the Politburo and the KGB senior leadership were thinking and what they wanted to know. This was intelligence more precious than the identities of individual officers, because it illuminated not just actions but intentions, not just what the Soviet Union was doing but why it was doing it and what it feared and what it hoped to achieve. The intelligence about Operation Ryan that he had been developing was becoming increasingly urgent in context by 1983, because the deterioration in superpower relations had been accelerating in ways that amplified Soviet anxiety to an almost dangerous degree. In September 1983, the Soviet Air Defense Forces shot down a Korean Airlines Boeing 747 that had strayed into Soviet airspace, killing all 269 people aboard. The Reagan administration's response was furious. The incident was presented in American rhetoric as evidence of the fundamental brutality of the Soviet system, and the resulting diplomatic atmosphere was one of sustained and bitter hostility. 1 month later, the United States invaded Grenada, an action that Moscow interpreted, through the lens of its deepest institutional suspicions, as further evidence of American willingness to use military force unilaterally and without restraint. And then, in November 1983, NATO conducted a military command exercise called Able Archer 83. Able Archer was, from the Western perspective, a routine annual command exercise, a simulation of the decision-making processes that would be employed in the event of a conventional conflict in Europe escalating to nuclear release. It was conducted through communications networks and command structures rather than through the movement of actual military assets, a paper exercise for the most part, though it involved the participation of senior political and military figures, including, in 1983, Caspar Weinberger, the American Defense Secretary, and other very senior officials who would normally have been too busy to participate in such exercises. The format of the 1983 exercise was also slightly different from previous iterations in certain respects that, to someone watching from the outside with deep anxiety and imperfect information, could easily look less like a simulation and more like a genuine preparation. Soviet intelligence was watching. Operation Ryan was active. The KGB residentiers across Western Europe had been tasked with monitoring precisely this kind of activity, looking for the warning signs of nuclear attack preparation that Moscow Center had identified as significant. And what they saw during Able Archer 83 was, through the distorting filter of institutionalized strategic fear, alarming. The specific details of what the Soviet intelligence services reported to Moscow about Able Archer 83 are partially available through declassified documents from both British and American archives, and they are, to the modern reader who knows how the episode ended, unsettling to contemplate. KGB reporting during the exercise period indicated that some Soviet intelligence analysts believed there was a genuine possibility that the West was using the exercise as cover for an actual first strike preparation. Soviet forces in Eastern Europe were raised to a higher level of alert. Intelligence collection was intensified. The specific indicators that Operation Ryan had identified as significant were being observed and reported with a seriousness that reflected the depth of Soviet strategic anxiety at that moment. Gordievsky was reporting on all of this in real time from his position inside the London residentia. He was producing intelligence about what the KGB was observing and how it was assessing it, intelligence that conveyed with unmistakable clarity that the Soviet response to Able Archer 83 was not rhetorical or performative but genuinely reflected a leadership that was worried about the possibility of war. The material reached the White House. Accounts differ about exactly how Ronald Reagan received and processed this intelligence, but what he said publicly in the months following Able Archer 83 showed a notable shift in tone. The language of evil empire persisted, but the confrontational edge was moderated. Reagan began speaking more explicitly about the possibility of dialogue and mutual understanding. He would later reflect, in his memoirs, that the intelligence he received about genuine Soviet fear of an American first strike had surprised him deeply and had changed his understanding of the strategic situation. The direct line from Gordievsky's reporting to a change in American presidential rhetoric, and from that change to a modest but measurable reduction in the temperature of the most dangerous relationship on Earth, is not something that can be proved in the mathematical sense. Historical causation is rarely that clean. But the intelligence community's assessment, reflected in the accounts of several senior SIS and CIA officers who have spoken about this period on the record, is that Gordievsky's intelligence about Soviet strategic anxiety contributed significantly to the policy recalibration that followed Able Archer 83. The idea that the intelligence produced by one man inside one KGB station may have had some role in pulling the world back from the edge of a catastrophic miscalculation is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is the considered judgment of serious people who knew the material. The tradecraft of Sunbeam's operation during this period was constantly managed with the kind of meticulous care that a source of this importance demanded. The intelligence product had to reach its ultimate consumers, British policymakers and their American counterparts, in forms that conveyed the intelligence without revealing the source, and this required creative and painstaking work by the analysts who processed and presented the material. Attribution could not point to a human source. The specific texture of the intelligence, which would have been recognizable to any senior KGB official as the product of someone with access to internal KGB communications, had to be protected through the construction of alternative plausible explanations for how the material had been obtained. This is routine intelligence work, but it becomes significantly more demanding when the source is as well-placed and therefore as identifiable as Sunbeam. For Gordievsky himself, the years from 1982 onward in London were also years of personal development and genuine engagement with British life. He cultivated his knowledge of British political culture, attended concerts at the Barbican and the Royal Festival Hall, visited museums and galleries with the genuine curiosity of a man who found the country's cultural life as stimulating as its political landscape. He made observations about the specific texture of British social interaction, the particular forms of understatement and indirect communication that characterized English public life, the institutional traditions that gave British democracy its distinctive character. These were not observations made for intelligence purposes alone. He was, in a real and unconcealed sense, in love with what Britain represented, and the deepening of that affection across the London years made his commitment to the double life he was living feel not simply like a practical decision but like something closer to a vocation. His career within the KGB was advancing in parallel with all of this. He was performing well in his official duties. His assessments were rated highly. His handling of his London responsibilities was professionally impeccable by the institutional standards of an organization that did not, of course, know the full scope of what its London representative was actually doing in his available hours. By 1984, Gordievsky's star within the KGB's London operations had risen to the point where he was being considered for the role of acting resident, the senior intelligence officer in the station, a position of remarkable authority that would give him oversight of the entire operation and access to the totality of what the KGB was attempting to accomplish in Britain. It was a position that, from the perspective of British intelligence, represented almost exactly what the word extraordinary means in its most literal sense. Their agent was about to become the head of the Soviet intelligence operation in the United Kingdom. The thought was enough to render quite calm and experienced intelligence professionals very briefly silent. There is a particular kind of institutional arrangement that intelligence services spend considerable time and considerable money trying to achieve, one in which a source so well placed within a target organization that the information they produce is not merely useful but genuinely transformative of the host service's understanding of the world. Such arrangements are rare. The combination of access and motivation and operational security that makes them possible is hard to create and harder to sustain. Some services go their entire institutional existence without running anything of this quality. The British Secret Intelligence Service, in the spring of 1984, found itself in the remarkable position of having such an arrangement become considerably more valuable than it had already been, because the man who had been their most important penetration of Soviet intelligence for a decade was being given command of the London KGB station. Gordievsky became acting resident in 1984, following the departure of the previous station chief, Arkady Guk, who had been expelled from Britain after his involvement in a Soviet intelligence operation had been exposed. The appointment placed Gordievsky in formal authority over all KGB intelligence activities in the United Kingdom, a position that in practice gave him oversight of a substantial network of officers and activities, from the recruitment and handling of British agents to the communication and reporting that linked the London station to Moscow Center. He was responsible for the station's staffing, its operational priorities, its administrative functioning, and its relationship with the broader Soviet diplomatic presence in London. He presided over the weekly station meetings where intelligence activities were reviewed and assessed. He directed the work of officers who had no idea that their superior officer was simultaneously the most important British intelligence asset against which the entire apparatus they were now answerable to was tasked. The intelligence he produced from this position was of a different quality and comprehensiveness than anything he had been able to provide as a junior and then middle-ranking officer. As acting resident, he was the recipient of Moscow Center's most sensitive communications to the London station, the tasking instructions and analytical assessments and strategic guidance that defined what Soviet intelligence in Britain was attempting to achieve. He had access to the reports that the station produced about its activities and the responses those reports generated. He understood, with the full clarity of command-level access, the complete scope of what the KGB was doing in Britain, who its agents were and what they were producing, what operations were in progress and what targets were being cultivated. He was passing this to British intelligence. The management challenge this created for the SIS was considerable. The intelligence was so specific, so clearly sourced from senior-level access within the KGB, that any use of it for operational purposes had to be handled with extraordinary delicacy. When the SIS used Sunbeam's intelligence to interfere with a specific Soviet operation, the interference had to be attributable in Soviet eyes to conventional counterintelligence work, to surveillance, to informants within the relevant British organizations, to luck, to anything other than a source inside the station itself. The counterintelligence wing of the SIS, working with the security service, had to manage the use of the intelligence with a discipline and creativity that few operations of any kind demand. Gordievsky was also, during this period, providing intelligence of direct personal relevance to the British Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher was in the final years of her first decade in power, engaged in the management of a Western alliance that was navigating the most complex period of superpower relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. She was given, through the careful channels that protect intelligence sources from identification, briefings based on Gordievsky's assessments of Soviet thinking, and specifically on the Soviet leadership's perceptions of Western intentions and motivations. The intelligence shaped her understanding of counterparts she was dealing with directly, particularly in the evolving situation around the Soviet leadership changes that would, in 1985, bring Mikhail Gorbachev to power. There is an account, well attested in the intelligence literature around this period, of a meeting in December 1984 at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, between Thatcher and Gorbachev, who was then a senior member of the Politburo and the General Secretary's most likely eventual successor. The meeting was arranged in part because British intelligence had assessed, based significantly on Gordievsky's intelligence about Soviet internal politics, that Gorbachev represented a different kind of Soviet leader, someone with whom Western governments could potentially conduct productive diplomacy. Thatcher came to the meeting well prepared, and she came away from it with the assessment that she famously expressed publicly in the days that followed, the statement that Gorbachev was a man she could do business with. This phrase entered diplomatic history as a description of the first Western recognition that the Soviet leadership was about to change in ways that would have profound geopolitical consequences. Gordievsky's intelligence about Gorbachev's role and significance within the Politburo was part of the analytical foundation on which that assessment rested. The connection between a KGB colonel's intelligence reports and a British Prime Minister's famous pronouncement about a future Soviet leader, which itself helped set the stage for the diplomatic engagement that would define the late Cold War, illustrates the kind of strategic reach that an agent of Sunbeam's quality could have on the most consequential decisions being made at the highest levels of government. During the same period, Gordievsky was engaged in the extraordinary additional service of briefing British ministers and senior officials directly. The SIS arranged a series of sessions in which he was able to speak with people in positions of significant governmental authority about Soviet thinking, Soviet methods, Soviet assessments of British and Western intentions, and the specific operations the KGB was running against British targets. These briefings were conducted under conditions that protected his identity, but they gave the people receiving them access to an analytical precision and a first-hand texture of understanding about the Soviet intelligence world that no amount of conventional research or secondary source assessment could have produced. He was, in effect, explaining the adversary to British policymakers in terms that carried the authority of someone who had lived inside that world for his entire adult professional career. He was also, throughout all of this, still a KGB officer in good professional standing, still filing his reports to Moscow, still managing his London station with the competence and authority that his superiors had come to expect. The scale of the performance his double life required has to be understood in its full dimensions to be properly appreciated. He was not simply concealing private thoughts while going about ordinary work. He was running a major KGB intelligence operation against British targets while simultaneously providing British intelligence with the detailed knowledge that allowed significant portions of that operation to be neutralized. He was meeting with Moscow Center officials who visited London while carrying in everything he said the discipline of a professional actor maintaining a role across a decade and a half, giving nothing away, showing nothing that diverged from the presentation of a committed and effective Soviet intelligence officer. The tradecraft skills that made this sustainable had been honed over many years. He was attentive to the security practices that protected him in his double role, careful about what he said to whom, alert to the institutional gossip and interpersonal dynamics of the London station in ways that kept him aware of any shift in how he was perceived by colleagues. He maintained the social habits that a senior Soviet officer was expected to maintain, attending the obligatory embassy social functions, participating in the collective life of the diplomatic Soviet community in London, performing the ideological and institutional solidarity that the KGB expected of its officers stationed in the capitalist West. There were moments that tested him. There were occasions when the two lives he was conducting came close enough together that the management of their separation required all the composure he possessed. A chance remark by a colleague. A question from a visiting Moscow Center official that probed slightly closer to an area of sensitivity than expected. A piece of operational information that reached the station from a source he did not know and could not place, suggesting that Moscow's collection against British targets had a dimension he was not fully informed about. Each of these moments passed. None of them became the thread that unraveled the fabric. But they accumulated in his awareness as evidence of the fundamental precariousness of the position he was holding, the ever-present knowledge that the margin between continued operation and catastrophic exposure was narrower than any comfortable assessment of the situation warranted. He managed the anxiety the only way it can genuinely be managed, by focusing on the work, by compartmentalizing the fear and setting it aside in whatever mental space he had developed for that purpose across many years of practice, by finding in the intelligence he was producing the reinforcement of purpose that made the risk sustainable. He was not doing this for personal gain. He had no financial motivation of any significance. He was doing it because he had concluded, with the full intellectual seriousness of a man who had thought carefully about morality and consequence, that it was the right thing to do, that the contribution he was making to the ability of the Western Alliance to understand and manage the Soviet threat served values he genuinely held against an adversary he had genuinely, through the accumulated evidence of his own experience, come to understand as genuinely threatening to human freedom. By early 1985, Gordievsky's career had reached its highest point. He was the acting head of KGB intelligence in the United Kingdom. He was the most valuable human intelligence source working for British intelligence. He was briefing British ministers and informing American presidents indirectly through the intelligence chain. He had been doing this for more than a decade, and there was no indication visible to him from inside the London station that his position was in any danger. The operation had survived longer than most comparable operations in the history of Cold War intelligence, had produced more of consequence than almost any single source in that history, and appeared to be continuing on a secure operational footing. He could not have known, in those early months of 1985, that in a quiet office in Langley, Virginia, a CIA officer who had cultivated substantial debts and a lifestyle his salary could not support was preparing to make a telephone call that would change everything. Aldrich Ames was born in 1941 in River Falls, Wisconsin, the son of a CIA officer, which meant that the intelligence world was not something he encountered as an adult professional, but something he had grown up adjacent to, absorbing its rhythms and culture and institutional personality from childhood. He joined the CIA in 1962, following in his father's footsteps with the unremarkable predictability of a man for whom the agency had always seemed like the natural destination, and he spent the following 2 decades pursuing a career that was, by most available assessments, solid but unexceptional. He was a case officer, the CIA designation for the officers who recruit and handle foreign agents, and he was competent enough at the work to advance through the organization's ranks and obtain postings and responsibilities commensurate with a mid-career professional in good standing. He was also, by the early 1980s, in substantial financial trouble. His first marriage had ended in a divorce that left him with alimony obligations and accumulated debt. His second marriage, to a Colombian woman named Rosario Casas Dupuy, had produced a lifestyle more expensive than his government salary could support. She had standards of living later investigated and documented by the congressional committees that examined the Ames case with thoroughgoing forensic attention, that ran considerably beyond the means of a CIA officer at his grade, and Ames had accumulated credit card debts and personal loans that were becoming difficult to service. He had a drinking problem. His performance reviews, examined in retrospect with the particular clarity that hindsight provides, show a man whose work had been growing increasingly unreliable, whose paperwork was disorganized, whose attention to operational detail was periodically compromised. The system that should have caught these warning signs earlier than it did failed to catch them, partly because institutional cultures create blind spots around their own members, and partly because Ames was performing just well enough most of the time to avoid triggering the more formal processes that might have looked at him more carefully. In April 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington carrying a package containing, among other things, a very brief note indicating that he was offering his services to Soviet intelligence. He was motivated, by his own subsequent account, primarily by money, though he has at various points offered other justifications that have been received with various degrees of skepticism. The KGB representative who handled the initial contact was almost certainly startled by the unsolicited approach, because unsolicited approaches from American intelligence officers are a category of contact that requires very careful assessment. The history of intelligence includes cases where such approaches were genuine and cases where they were provocations or tests, and the usual institutional response is caution and verification before any substantial trust is extended. But Ames came with credentials, came with access, and came with the kind of demonstrated knowledge that made the question of his genuineness easier to settle than it might have been with a less senior source. He was, at the relevant moment, the head of the CIA's Soviet counterintelligence section, a position of extraordinary sensitivity that gave him knowledge of the CIA's Russian operations and sources that practically nobody in the United States government was better placed to hold. He knew who the CIA's sources inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus were. He knew the identities and operational details of human intelligence assets, whose compromise would be catastrophic for Western intelligence collection against the Soviet Union. He offered this knowledge to the KGB, and he was paid for it handsomely over the years that followed, in a financial arrangement that eventually resulted in him receiving somewhere in the region of $4.5 million from the Soviet and then Russian intelligence services across the period of his treachery. His first substantive communication to the KGB, in June 1985, included the identities of essentially all the CIA's human intelligence assets inside the Soviet Union to whom he had access. The disclosure was enormous in its scope, a comprehensive betrayal of the entire Western intelligence collection apparatus against the Soviet Union that represented, from Moscow's perspective, one of the greatest intelligence windfalls since the Cambridge Five had stripped British intelligence of its secrets 40 years before. Among the names and cases Ames disclosed in that June package to the KGB was a case the CIA had been briefed on through liaison channels with the British Secret Intelligence Service. A KGB colonel in London whose British codename was known within the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangements. The KGB now knew about Sunbeam. This is where the story arrives at one of those junctions that intelligence history marks with a particular weight, because what happened next was not what might have happened next, and the difference between what did happen and what could have happened directly determines whether Oleg Gordievsky survived. The KGB's counterintelligence apparatus did not immediately act on the Ames disclosure by arresting Gordievsky in London and charging him with treason. They could see advantages in handling it more carefully. The Soviet intelligence culture, shaped by decades of experience with penetrations and counterpenetrations, understood that the hasty arrest of a mole whose exposure came from a source you wanted to protect might compromise that source. Ames was far too valuable to burn through the careless exposure of how his information had been used. Beyond that, there was the possibility of managing Gordievsky in a way that extracted additional intelligence advantage from his continued apparent freedom, perhaps feeding him disinformation to pass back to the British, perhaps using him as a channel for operational deception on a large scale. The decision that Moscow Center made was to recall Gordievsky to Moscow for a different kind of handling, away from the jurisdiction of British law and the practical difficulties of acting against a serving officer within a hostile foreign country. The phone call on May 17, 1985, had been the mechanism of that decision. He was called back for consultations, and in the context of everything that had preceded those 33 words, those consultations were understood by those placing the call to mean something very specific. What Gordievsky carried back to Moscow on that flight was not merely his luggage and his briefing papers. He carried the accumulated weight of everything he had built over more than a decade, the intelligence relationships, the assessments, the hundreds of individual pieces that he had passed from one world to the other, the knowledge of what it had cost in terms of sustained psychological effort and the permanent suppression of ordinary human transparency. He arrived in Moscow in a city he had left as a rising KGB officer with a confident institutional standing and returned to as a man whose position had, unknown to him, fundamentally changed. He reported to Yassenevo as instructed and was received by colleagues with the ordinary warmth of an institution welcoming back a senior officer from a significant posting. He gave briefings about the London station, answered questions about operations and personnel, engaged in the routine administrative activity of a returned officer. Nothing in the surface of his reception indicated that his standing had changed. And yet something was different. There were moments, small ones, the kind you notice only when you already have reason to be watching, where a question pressed slightly harder than it needed to, where the warmth felt slightly more managed than genuine, where the space between professional pleasantries was fractionally longer than the natural rhythm of conversation would have produced. He had been doing this long enough to notice. He had spent 15 years managing the precise calibration of this kind of social reading, distinguishing genuine responses from performed ones, genuine trust from simulated trust, the real warmth of colleagues who had no reason to doubt him from the more careful warmth of colleagues who did. He was sensitive to these signals with the acuity of someone whose operational survival had depended on reading them accurately for a very long time. What he noticed was enough to confirm what the logic of the situation had already suggested. Something had changed in how Moscow regarded him, and the change was not small and not, he was beginning to understand, reversible by any performance he could mount. The KGB was patient. It was methodical. It was experienced in the management of its suspicions, and it was entirely capable of receiving a recalled officer with all the institutional warmth required while simultaneously building the case that would eventually justify a very different kind of reception. He was in Moscow, under the authority of the organization he had been deceiving for 15 years, and the question of whether and how he would leave was no longer straightforwardly his own to answer. He thought about the signal. During all the years of the London operation, there had been a contingency. The SIS had planned for the possibility that an emergency might arise, that Sunbeam might need to activate an extraction in circumstances where normal communication channels were not available, where the use of established contact methods was either impossible or had become too dangerous. The protocol was simple in concept, though the simplicity was carefully designed to make it executable under precisely the conditions of surveillance and pressure that Gordievsky now found himself operating under. If he needed to signal that the extraction plan should be activated, he could do so through a public act in a specified location in Moscow, at a specified time, in a way that would be observed by British intelligence personnel who would be watching for exactly this signal. He had been in Moscow for weeks. He was under observation. He was living in his apartment, making calls that were almost certainly monitored, going to Yassenevo each day, maintaining the performance of an officer who had returned from London and was awaiting his next assignment. He had not yet activated the signal. He had not been sure, with the certainty required to justify the risk of activating it, that the point of no return had actually been reached. But as the days turned into weeks, and as the accumulation of small signals about his changed status continued to build in his peripheral awareness, he began to calculate with growing deliberateness that the window in which activation was possible might not remain open indefinitely. He needed to move, and he needed to do it before Moscow Center decided that patience had run its course. The interrogation did not begin with a confrontation. It did not begin with accusation or evidence or any of the more direct mechanisms through which organizations that have identified a traitor in their midst typically proceed toward the resolution of the problem. It began instead with an invitation, and the form of the invitation was chosen with the particular archness that the KGB occasionally displayed when it was managing a situation that it understood to require more finesse than the blunt application of institutional authority. The meeting was framed as a pre-departure briefing. Gordievsky was told that before his next posting could be confirmed, as though a next posting remained an operational reality rather than a fiction maintained for management purposes, certain senior figures wished to meet with him to discuss strategic priorities. The meeting would take place at a dacha outside Moscow, one of those comfortable country retreats that the KGB's senior leadership maintained and used for the kind of business that benefited from distance from the formal institutional environment of Yasenevo. He was told this in tones of collegial routine, as though the invitation were unremarkable, and the gap between the collegial tone and what his assessed understanding of the situation told him was almost certainly true produced the specific kind of dread that only people who have spent their professional lives navigating between true and performed realities can fully understand. He went. The alternative, declining or attempting to delay beyond what was professionally plausible, would have constituted a more visible reaction to nothing, officially, than he could justify. Every move he made in this period had to be calibrated to the standard of the performance he had maintained for 15 years, the performance of a man who had nothing to hide, no particular reason to be anxious, no awareness of any changed relationship with the organization he served. Any deviation from that performance, any move that suggested he knew what he was suspected of, would have accelerated the timetable of whatever the KGB was planning for him and narrowed the operational window he was trying to keep open. The dacha was comfortable in the way Soviet institutional facilities were comfortable when they were designed for senior officials, functional but not lavish, clean and well-maintained, located in the birch forests outside Moscow where the trees in late May were in full early summer leaf, their white trunks marking the landscape with a cleanness that felt at odds with the atmosphere of the encounter. He was driven there in an official car and received by 2 KGB officers whose ranks and positions within the counterintelligence apparatus he noted and stored with the professional precision of a man who understood the significance of personnel choices in institutional encounters of this kind. The conversation that followed was not, initially, a conversation about treason. It covered a range of operational and administrative topics related to the London posting, questions about specific operations, about personnel assessments, about relationships with sources and contacts. Gordievsky answered these questions with the same precise competence and apparent openness that he had brought to 15 years of KGB professional life, providing detail where detail was appropriate, being appropriately circumspect where circumspection was institutionally normal, performing the role of an experienced and cooperative officer engaged in a standard professional review. Then, at a point in the conversation that he has described in his memoirs as coming without particular warning, the atmosphere changed. One of the officers produced a bottle of cognac and poured glasses for everyone present, in the manner of a social gesture that also happens to be something else. Gordievsky drank a portion of what was in the glass. He has noted, in subsequent accounts, that what he felt in the period following was consistent with the effects of a chemical compound administered in conjunction with a relatively small amount of alcohol, a compound that Soviet intelligence was known to use in interrogation contexts to lower the subject's inhibitions and impair the higher-order cognitive functions that maintain a practice cover story under pressure. The compound later assessed to have been used was referred to in intelligence community discussions as SP-117, a Soviet-developed pharmacological agent whose effects are broadly analogous to drugs that were investigated by the CIA during the same period under the more notorious heading of Mkultra, substances intended to reduce a subject's capacity for the disciplined management of what they say. The interrogation during the drugged phase was conducted, according to his subsequent account, around questions about his contacts with foreign nationals in London, about meetings outside official diplomatic channels, about his activities during specific periods. The questions were structured to provide a trained analyst with reference points against which a subject's responses could be assessed for deceptive patterns. They were not direct accusations. They were the kind of questions that produce incriminating answers only if the subject knows more than they should, and the production of those answers is made more likely by a pharmacological state that makes disciplined concealment harder to maintain. Gordievsky survived the session. This is not a trivial statement. The combination of a sophisticated interrogation framework and a pharmacological intervention designed specifically to impair the cognitive defenses that a trained intelligence officer would employ in exactly this situation was genuinely formidable. And the fact that he did not, under these conditions, produce the kind of incriminating statement that would have given Moscow Center the confirmation it needed to move from suspicion to formal accusation requires some explanation. He has offered, in his accounts of this episode, a combination of explanations that is probably collectively accurate rather than individually sufficient. His training, the years of practice at managing the gap between what he felt and what he presented, had built mental habits so deep that they persisted even under pharmacological pressure. He had a genuine and disciplined understanding of what he must not say, and that understanding had, through years of practice, achieved something close to automaticity, a response pattern that operated at a level below the higher cognitive functions that the drug was interfering with. He was also, as he noted with characteristic dryness in his memoir, sufficiently aware of what was being done to him and sufficiently determined not to be destroyed by it that he maintained what conscious control he could, accepting the sedative effects but resisting as much as possible the interrogation prompts. He was driven back to Moscow. He returned to his apartment. He went, the following week, to Yasenevo and continued his institutional routine. The interrogation session had not produced a confession, and in the absence of a confession, the KGB's formal case against him remained circumstantial. By Soviet institutional and legal standards, the available evidence against a senior officer of his standing and service record required development before a formal charge could be brought, and Moscow Center's approach was accordingly to permit him a degree of operational freedom while continuing to build the case through observation, surveillance, and whatever further interrogation opportunities presented themselves. Freedom, of course, was not quite the right word. He was being watched. He understood that he was being watched. Surveillance in Moscow was a different proposition from surveillance in London or Copenhagen, because the instruments of social control were so much more comprehensively woven into the fabric of ordinary urban life. Neighbors, building managers, telephone operators, transport officials, all existed within a network of relationships with the security services that made them, whether as willing informants or simply as people who understood the social expectations around reporting unusual behavior, potential eyes on his movements. A KGB officer of his long experience understood this with the intimacy of someone who had participated in the same systems from the other side and knew exactly how they worked. He moved through the city with the practiced normality that his situation demanded, the unhurried pace and unremarkable routine of a man with nothing to hide, shopping in the ordinary shops on his way home from work, taking the same routes through the same streets that any officer in his position might take, using no communication channel that his surveillance might flag as unusual, making no contact with anyone whose contact could not be accounted for by his official role. He was, in the outward visible texture of his daily life, exactly the KGB colonel he had always been, and the sustained performance of this ordinariness under conditions of real and constant surveillance was perhaps the most demanding thing he had ever done. And underneath the performance, in the privacy of a mind that no pharmacological intervention and no amount of surveillance could make fully transparent, he was thinking very carefully about a specific day, a specific time, a specific stretch of street in Moscow, and a specific sequence of actions that, if he executed them at the right moment and without error, would communicate to the people watching from across the divide that the time had arrived, that Sunbeam was ready to come in. The signal was everything now. The signal was his only real option, the last meaningful piece of agency he possessed in a situation that had compressed his choices down to a very narrow set. The question was finding the moment to use it, a moment when the surveillance around him was sufficiently reduced to permit the action without immediate interception, a moment that could not be artificially created and could not be long delayed, a moment that had to be seized when it presented itself or possibly not at all. He had been in Moscow since May. It was now a warm and pressing July. Moscow in the summer of 1985 had the particular quality of a city that knows something is wrong but cannot identify exactly what. The political atmosphere of the Soviet capital had been in a state of succession uncertainty for years, the elderly and ailing general secretaries of the late Brezhnev period giving way to the brief incumbencies of Andropov and Chernenko before Gorbachev's arrival in March, had introduced a new and noticeably different energy into Soviet political life. Gorbachev was young by the standards of Soviet leadership, vigorous, apparently attentive to the real conditions of Soviet society in a way that his predecessors had long ceased to be. The people who encountered him in professional contexts felt the difference, though the degree to which his apparent reformist orientation would translate into actual institutional change remained deeply uncertain. Hope and skepticism coexisted in roughly equal measure, because the Soviet system had a history of disappointing hope, and the people who lived inside it had developed, across years of accumulated experience, the kind of reserved and qualified optimism that protects itself by not investing too completely in possibilities that may prove illusory. For Gordievsky, the arrival of Gorbachev was irrelevant to his immediate situation, which had nothing to do with the direction of Soviet political reform and everything to do with the specific and personal question of whether and when Moscow Center would decide that the available evidence against him was sufficient to justify moving from the phase of managed surveillance and controlled interrogation to the phase of formal arrest. He was operating, as July began, in a daily existence shaped by two simultaneous imperatives that were almost entirely at odds with each other. He had to maintain the performance of normality at all times, give the surveillance apparatus surrounding him nothing to flag as deviant behavior, continue presenting himself as an officer under no particular pressure whose daily routine was shaped by professional obligations and ordinary personal life. At exactly the same time, he needed to find the conditions under which he could execute the escape signal, which required breaking from routine in a specific and observable way at a specific and observable location, a deviation that would be meaningful only if the right people were watching and meaningless only if the wrong people were watching more carefully than the right people could safely permit. The surveillance question was at the center of everything. He had, through his experience and his understanding of how the KGB managed its observations of persons under suspicion, a reasonable professional sense of when his surveillance was heavier and when it was lighter. He was not under the kind of around-the-clock intensive monitoring that would have indicated Moscow Center had moved from suspicion to near certainty. The surveillance he faced was steady and systematic but managed with the institutional pragmatism of an organization that could not devote unlimited resources to any single target, that had to balance the coverage of multiple cases simultaneously, and that had its own operational rhythms that created predictable patterns if you knew how to read them. He observed these patterns. He catalogued the surveillance he could detect with the same methodical precision he had brought to every other intelligence challenge in his professional life. He noted the cars that appeared regularly in the vicinity of his apartment. He identified the individuals whose presence in his daily trajectory recurred with a frequency beyond coincidence. He assessed the degree of close attention on different days and at different times of day, building a picture of when and where the observation was most intense and when relative openings existed. He did not intend to lose a fixed surveillance team, which was effectively impossible under Moscow conditions without a level of active counter-surveillance that would itself constitute suspicious behavior. He was looking for something narrower, the right moment at the right location when the conditions of his monitoring were consistent with a brief, apparently unremarkable break from his route that the people watching would have no particular reason to document as significant. He had been given permission, through the maintained fiction of the normal professional life he was still officially conducting, to take a short running holiday in the days ahead. Soviet officers were expected, like Soviet citizens generally, to take their allotted vacation time, and a request for a brief recreational break in early July was the kind of administratively routine thing that would not attract attention. The permission was granted with the bureaucratic indifference of an institution processing a normal request, and the permission created the slight operational opening he needed, because the precise movements of a man on his own time were monitored in a slightly different way, with some of the formal close surveillance maintained but with the continuous intensive coverage that his work location provided necessarily reduced. The escape signal that he had agreed with his British handlers during the London operation was designed for exactly this kind of constrained opening. It was intended to be executable in conditions of surveillance, to appear to any Soviet observer as precisely the kind of unremarkable public behavior that a man going about his day might reasonably exhibit, while being, to the eyes of a British intelligence officer stationed at the designated observation point, an unmistakable communication that the extraction plan should immediately activate. The signal, as has been described in accounts including Gordievsky's own memoir and in Christopher Andrew and Gordievsky's collaborative intelligence history, involved him appearing at a particular location in Moscow at a particular time, carrying a specific item and performing a specific small action. The location was a street near a bread shop in a Moscow neighborhood. The time was early afternoon on a specified day of the week. The item was a British carrier bag, the kind of shopping bag that a man returning from a period in London might plausibly own and use. The action was to stand near the shop for a short period and unwrap a specific food item, the combination of location and timing and props constituting, in their assembly, a message that required no verbal communication, no electronic transmission, nothing that could be intercepted or decoded by the counterintelligence apparatus that was monitoring him. British intelligence had personnel in Moscow watching for this signal. The SIS maintained, as all major intelligence services did in Moscow, a presence under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy, and the operational planning that had gone into the Pimlico extraction protocol included specific arrangements for maintaining observation of the designated signal point at the designated times. These arrangements required someone to be at the right place at the right time, watching without appearing to watch, in a city where Western diplomats were themselves routinely subjected to surveillance by the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, the organization responsible for monitoring foreigners in the Soviet Union. The watchers had to pass the signal back through channels that would activate the extraction plan on the British side without triggering any Soviet awareness that an extraction was being planned. The morning of the day Gordievsky chose to send the signal was a Thursday in early July 1985. He woke in his Moscow apartment as he had woken each day for the weeks of his enforced return, in the specific kind of alertness that comes not from refreshed sleep but from the slow exhaustion of sustained high-stakes performance. He dressed. He took his usual route toward the area he needed to reach, moving at the pace of someone on a recreational break from professional obligations, carrying among his relatively ordinary daily accompaniments the British carrier bag he had brought from London, an item that in the context of a diplomat's ordinary life was entirely unremarkable. He reached the area near the bread shop with the measured approach of a man who has no particular reason to hurry. He stood at a point with appropriate sightlines. He waited at the location for the time required by the protocol. A British intelligence officer, positioned at the observation point through the cover of what appeared to be an ordinary diplomatic errand in this part of Moscow, saw him. Saw the bag, saw the sequence of actions, understood what it meant. Gordievsky turned and walked away in the direction from which he had come, maintaining the unhurried pace of a man who had stopped to look in a shop window and was now continuing about his day. He did not know with certainty whether the signal had been received. He could not know. The protocol was designed that way, with the necessary unidirectionality of an emergency communication transmitted into an ambiguous space, where confirmation of receipt was impossible without the kind of counter-signal that would have created its own security risks. He had done what he could do. He had sent the message into the only channel available to him. Now he had to go home, continue the performance that his survival depended on, and wait to learn whether the mechanism he had set in motion was going to function as designed. On the British side, a very different kind of activity was beginning. The signal had been received and authenticated. The intelligence officers who saw it were certain of what they had witnessed. The communication that followed, back through the secure channels of the SIS, activated a plan that had been prepared against exactly this contingency and that had been kept in a state of readiness throughout the years of Gordievsky's Moscow posting. The plan was called Operation Pimlico. Its purpose was to drive a man out of the Soviet Union in the boot of a car before the Soviet security services could arrest him and execute him for treason. The British side had work to do, and they had to do it in days. Operation Pimlico had not been improvised. The most important extraction operations in the history of Western intelligence are never improvised, because the conditions that make improvisation necessary are the conditions in which improvisation is most likely to fail, and the consequences of failure in an operation of this kind are not professional embarrassment but execution. The planning that produced Pimlico had been built into the architecture of the Sunbeam operation from its earliest years, a contingency with its own staffing, its own logistics, its own operational protocols, maintained in a state of readiness through all the years of Gordievsky's London work against the possibility that one day the emergency lever would need to be pulled. The broad outlines of what Pimlico required were determined by the specific geography of Gordievsky's situation. He was in Moscow, a city that was not merely the capital of the Soviet Union but the most surveilled and security-conscious urban environment on Earth, a city where exit was controlled, where foreigners were monitored, where the state's apparatus of observation and interdiction was more complete than anywhere else in the Soviet bloc. Getting a man out of Moscow and across an international border under those conditions, without the USSR's internal security apparatus intercepting him, required a plan that worked with the available covers rather than against them, that exploited the specific structural features of how Soviet border security actually functioned in ways that no amount of military or diplomatic pressure could match. The decision made by the Pimlico planners was to use the diplomatic vehicle exemption. Soviet customs and border controls maintained a standing operational arrangement with respect to the vehicles of foreign diplomats, which were ordinarily not subject to the kind of search that the vehicles of Soviet citizens or non-diplomatic foreigners would receive at border crossing points. This exemption was not absolute. It was a matter of convention and practical diplomatic management rather than guaranteed legal protection, but it was well established and in normal circumstances was reliably observed. If Gordievsky could be concealed inside a diplomatic vehicle, the vehicle would stand a reasonable chance of passing through a Soviet border post without the level of search that would uncover a hidden human being. The route selected was north toward Finland. The Finnish border was approximately 1,000 kilometers from Moscow, a distance manageable by road across a summer day, and the specific crossing point of Valama on the Finnish side, referred to in Soviet records by its Russian name, offered certain operational advantages in its geography and normal traffic patterns that the planners had assessed as preferable to alternative routes. Finland's particular political position in the Cold War landscape, the neutral but Western-leaning status it had maintained through decades of careful diplomatic calibration between East and West, meant that once across the border, the operational environment changed immediately and completely. Finland was not NATO territory, but it was not Soviet territory either, and the bilateral arrangements governing the presence of Soviet intelligence personnel in Finland did not extend to the authority to detain and return someone on Finnish soil who had crossed into the country legally in a diplomatic vehicle. The SIS team that was assembling for Pimlico was a small one. The operation required people with diplomatic cover who could travel to Moscow plausibly, who could execute the operational plan without attracting the kind of attention that a large and visible operation would generate, and who had the specific combination of skills and composure that the job demanded. The emotional and psychological demands of an extraction operation of this kind were not trivial. You were driving through a totalitarian state with a man hidden inside your vehicle, knowing that discovery meant at minimum a severe diplomatic crisis, and for the person in the boot, something considerably worse. The people who did this had to maintain the presentation of ordinary diplomatic normality throughout, the calm and unremarkable appearance of people traveling in a diplomatic car, while managing whatever internal state the reality of the situation produced. There were children involved. This detail, which has a quality of both careful planning and something almost entirely human, appears in Gordievsky's memoir and in later accounts of the operation by people with knowledge of it. One of the SIS personnel traveling in the extraction convoy included a family with young children, whose presence served a specific operational purpose in addition to providing cover. Children in a car created a natural and observable level of domestic disorder, prams and food and nappies and the specific paraphernalia that accompanies families traveling with very small infants, and this disorder was itself part of the operational planning because it created, among its other functions, a set of smells that any dog deployed for a search of the vehicle would encounter before registering the human smell of a man in a sealed space. The dog problem was one that the Pimlico planners had thought about carefully. Soviet border inspection at major crossing points included, at various periods and in various degrees of consistent application, the use of trained dogs capable of detecting human presence in vehicle spaces not designed for human occupation. This capability was not uniformly deployed or uniformly effective, and the specific conditions at the Valama crossing point, assessed from intelligence about normal operational practice at that location, suggested that the dog risk was real but not guaranteed to be encountered. The nappy issue was not, therefore, a guaranteed solution to a guaranteed problem. It was a sensible operational measure against a contingency that might or might not materialize. On the Gordievsky side, The days between his activation of the escape signal and the day of the extraction involved the maintenance of a performance that was becoming genuinely acute in its demands. He had received no direct confirmation that Pimlico was active. The protocol did not permit direct communication in the period immediately preceding an extraction, precisely because such communication would itself generate a pattern of contact that the surveillance apparatus might flag. He was operating on the reasonable assumption, based on everything he knew about how the British operated, that the signal had been received and that the plan was moving, but he could not be certain, and the uncertainty had to be held inside the same compartment as all the other things he was holding inside that compartment, along with the surveillance around him, the awareness of what had happened at the dacha, and the assessment that the time he had before Moscow Center made its formal move was finite and possibly quite short. He had been given permission, as noted, for brief recreational activity during this period. He used some of this time for running, a leisure activity entirely consistent with the healthy outdoor pursuits Soviet citizens were encouraged to maintain, and one that provided a natural reason to be moving through the city at an early morning hour when the surveillance was lightest, and that provided a physical management of the anxiety that would otherwise have had no release. He ran through the Moscow streets in the early morning, observing the city with the specific attentiveness of a man who is looking at it possibly for the last time and is aware of this possibility with full cognitive clarity. He told his wife nothing. This has to be understood in the context of what it meant and what it cost. Layla was his wife, the mother of his daughters, a woman who had built her life around a man who was, she believed, a devoted Soviet intelligence officer, a man whose work was demanding and sometimes required secrecy and sometimes meant long absences, but who was, in the understanding she had constructed from the available evidence, the man she had married in essentially the terms in which marriage normally operates. He could tell her nothing of what was happening. He could not say that the surveillance she might have noticed was real, that the reason for their return from London was not official business but institutional suspicion, that the consultations at Yasenevo were not routine but the beginning of a process that could end in his arrest and execution. He could not tell her that he might leave one day very soon and that leaving might mean never coming back, that the daughter she had borne in the years of his London posting might grow up without their father because their father had decided, years before they were born, that the most important thing he could do with his life was spy against the country whose government had put a price on that decision. He carried this with him. He carried it the way he had learned to carry all the things that could not be shared, in the sealed container of a professional training whose deepest purpose had always been the management of exactly this kind of isolation. The British team arrived in Moscow and began moving into the operational positions that Pimlico required. The timings were set. The vehicles were readied. The route to the border had been planned with the care of people who had examined every available source of intelligence about the conditions at each point along the way and who understood, with full professional sobriety, that this was not a simulation. Gordievsky was going to need to run. The morning of July 19, 1985 began for Gordievsky before the city fully woke. He rose in the gray-blue light of early Moscow morning when the summer sky outside his window had the particular quality of a day that has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be, the dawn light cold and uncommitted, the streets below his apartment quiet save for the earliest trams and the occasional sound of a vehicle moving through an intersection. He dressed for running, as he had on other mornings during his enforced Moscow stay. The running clothes were not a disguise. They were operationally useful because they were normal, because a man going for a morning run in running clothes was the most unremarkably Soviet thing a person could do on a July morning, and unremarkable was precisely what this morning required him to be from the first moment he stepped outside his front door. He carried nothing that he had not carried on other runs. He took no bags, made no preparations visible enough to be noted by anyone observing him. The decisions about what he was leaving behind had been made in the weeks of quiet deliberation that had preceded this morning, made not in any single moment of resolution but gradually, through the slow acceptance of what was and was not possible to carry out of this country in the circumstances that applied to him. He was leaving behind his wife. He was leaving behind his daughters. He was leaving behind everything that constituted the ordinary material of a life, the furniture and the books and the things accumulated across 47 years of living in a city and a country and a system that he had chosen, definitively and irrevocably, to betray, though betray was not quite the word he would have chosen, not the word he would choose now for a decision whose moral logic had seemed to him, across the many years since Prague, entirely sufficient. He left his apartment building and turned his steps not toward the running route he had used on other mornings but toward the area near the Kutuzovsky Prospect, a location whose operational significance existed entirely in the memory of two parties who had agreed on it years before in a different city and a different context. The pickup point had been designated during the London years, part of the Pimlico planning, a specific segment of Moscow Street where a diplomatic car could stop briefly without attracting immediate attention, long enough for a man to get in and be driven away, short enough that the pause would not register as significant to any surveillance that might be observing the area with less than their full professional attention at the moment it happened. He ran. He ran through the Moscow streets in the early morning with the pace and the posture of a man who runs regularly and knows how his body moves, maintaining the appearance of nothing more consequential than mild cardiovascular exercise, measuring the distance to the pickup point in his internal navigation while keeping his external presentation entirely contained within the ordinary. There were other people in the streets. There were trams. There were other runners. There was the specific quality of Moscow summer morning that he had known since childhood, the smell of the linden trees that lined certain avenues in bloom, the peculiar acoustic quality of the city before the full weight of its daily noise assembled, the light strengthening from gray toward gold above the rooflines. He arrived at the designated area and began moving through it at the pace his plan required, watching for the car, watching for the specific car whose details he had been given through whatever communication had been possible across the operational silence of the preceding days. In accounts of this moment, including Gordievsky's own, there is a description of a delay, a period during which the car did not appear at the expected moment, long enough that the trained capacities of a man who had spent 15 years managing exactly this kind of operational uncertainty were genuinely tested. He kept moving. He did not stand and wait, because standing and waiting would have created exactly the visible behavioral anomaly that the operational plan required him to avoid. He moved through the area at a pace consistent with a man continuing exercise, which he was, and waited for the moment to resolve itself. The car appeared. It was a Saab, carrying British diplomatic personnel, and it stopped at the designated point long enough for Gordievsky to approach and get inside. He was in the car. He was moving. The first phase of Pimlico had functioned as planned. The operation involved two vehicles, a detail that became clear in the accounts that have subsequently been made public. The Saab that picked him up drove to a rendezvous point outside the immediate Moscow urban area, where the transfer was made to the second car, a Volvo that would carry the extraction convoy north. The reasons for the two-vehicle structure were operational in the standard sense, providing a layer of separation between the pickup in Moscow and the vehicle that would cross the border, so that any surveillance of the initial pickup, if it occurred, would be tracking a vehicle that was no longer carrying Gordievsky by the time it became apparent that something unusual had happened. He was put in the boot of the Volvo. The space was small, as the boots of family cars are, not designed for a human being but for luggage and the ordinary cargo of domestic travel. He was given a thermal blanket, a foil-lined emergency blanket of the kind designed for use in outdoor emergencies, intended to reduce his body heat signature to the level that would be less likely to register on any thermal or infrared detection equipment that might be used at a border inspection point. The blanket crinkled slightly with every movement. The space smelled of car, of rubber and metal, and the specific closed-air quality of a boot that has been cleaned recently but retains the accumulated scent of all its previous contents. He arranged himself as best he could in the available space and heard the boot close above him with the soft mechanical sound of a latch engaging. He was in the dark. The car began to move. The movement transferred through the metal around him as vibration, the road surface communicating itself in bumps and tremors and the particular rhythm of a vehicle traveling at highway speed, and he felt these vibrations with the whole of his body because there was nothing between him and the car's structure but the blanket and whatever small physical separation he could maintain by bracing himself against the sides. He could hear sounds through the metal, muffled but identifiable, the sound of the engine and the wind, and occasionally, faintly, the sounds of the other people in the car, the people who were ostensibly a diplomatic family on a recreational drive and who were carrying, in their boot, a man who occupied in the history of the Cold War a position that none of them could yet fully appreciate. There were children in the car. The noise they made was real, the particular noise of small children on a long journey, and it mixed with the sounds of the journey itself in a way that contributed to the presentation that the car's occupants were maintaining, the presentation of an ordinary diplomatic family, somewhat disordered by the natural disordering effects of children and luggage and the minor frictions of a long drive. The nappies were real. The smells were real. The operational cover was functional in every available dimension. He could not see how much time was passing. He could feel the quality of the road change as the convoy moved out of the Moscow region and north, the road surface and the character of the vibration shifting through the hours of the drive with a texture that spoke, if you were in a condition to read such things, of the increasing distance between him and the city where everything he had known for 47 years was concentrated. He was moving north toward Finland, toward the border, toward the point where one world ended and another began, and he was doing it in a car boot with a foil blanket and the sounds of children and the smell of nappies. The convoy stopped at least once, not at a border point, before reaching the Finnish border zone. The specific circumstances of the stop, whether it was for fuel or food or some minor mechanical attention, are not fully detailed in the public accounts, but the character of these moments, the waiting in darkness while ordinary sounds proceeded above and around you, had a specific quality that Gordievsky has described as demanding a kind of stillness that was mental as much as physical. You could not shift position meaningfully in a car boot. You could not cough or clear your throat loudly or make any sound that would carry beyond the metal walls of the space you occupied. You were reduced, functionally, to a near-total passivity, dependent entirely on the competence and composure of the people in the car above you and on the operational planning of people who were not currently present, and on whatever the border guards at Valoma would or would not do when a British diplomatic Volvo pulled up to their checkpoint with a family inside and a man in the dark below. The border was drawing closer. He could feel it in the quality of the drive, the way the road changed, the slowing that preceded the approach to an official checkpoint, the sounds above him shifting towards something more careful and contained. The performance of ordinariness was, at this specific moment, being maintained by people who were very much aware that they were approaching the most consequential moment of the entire operation, and who were managing that awareness with the discipline of professionals trained for precisely this. Gordievsky lay still in the dark and waited. The border between the Soviet Union and Finland at Valoma, known on the Soviet side as the Torfyanovka checkpoint, was a place where two worlds did not simply adjoin but actively confronted each other across a heavily secured perimeter of fences and watchtowers and cleared ground that communicated, with considerable architectural bluntness, the Soviet state's relationship to the idea of free movement. The checkpoint itself was a structure designed to slow and inspect and process people through a system of barriers and documentation checks and procedural requirements that had the cumulative effect, intended or otherwise, of making the experience of leaving the Soviet Union feel like something undertaken only under duress or official sanction, never as a simple matter of personal choice. On the Finnish side, within a few hundred meters of all this institutional heavy-handedness, the Finnish border facilities were modest and relatively unremarkable, staffed by officers whose manner reflected a country that had its own complicated relationship with its enormous eastern neighbor but that retained, even so, the essential atmospheric relaxedness of a democratic state. The convoy approached the Soviet checkpoint in the late afternoon of July 19th. The specific time has been confirmed in various historical accounts at approximately around the late afternoon period, though the precise configuration of events at the checkpoint is known in its general outline but not in every operational detail, some of which remains outside the public record for reasons of continued intelligence sensitivity. What is known, from Gordievsky's account and from subsequent partial disclosures by British intelligence officials, is that the inspection at the Soviet checkpoint involved the vehicle being examined by border guards in the standard manner, with the passengers' documents reviewed and processed, and that at some point during this inspection a dog was brought to the vehicle. This was the moment around which all the planning converged. The dog, trained for exactly this purpose, was walked around the vehicle by its handler while the documentary formalities were being completed, and the dog spent time in the vicinity of the boot, the space less than a foot from which a man lay flattened against the floor of a car with a foil blanket covering him. The operational planning had anticipated this contingency and had addressed it through the practical measures available. The child, the nappies, the food wrapping, the sensory disorder of a family car that had been driving with small children for several hours, All of it had been deployed not with any guarantee of outcome but with the professional assessment that it created conditions less favorable to the dog's detection of Gordievsky's presence than the alternative. The car also carried a bag of strong-smelling crisps that had been opened strategically, contributing further to the olfactory noise that the dog's handler would receive through whatever the dog communicated. The dog did not alert. The reason for this, whether it was the deliberate countermeasure or some aspect of the dog's condition or training on that particular day, or simply the accumulation of small favorable circumstances that attend all successful covert operations alongside all the careful planning, cannot be known with certainty, and it is one of those genuine historical ambiguities that accounts of this episode have generally been willing to acknowledge as such. What can be said is that the dog was walked around the vehicle and returned to its handler without having identified the presence of an additional person in the boot, and that the inspection continued and concluded with the convoy being waved through the checkpoint in the standard manner afforded to diplomatic vehicles. The car crossed the border. Gordievsky lay in the dark of the boot on the Finnish side of the border crossing and could not yet know this was where he was. He could hear the sounds above him and around him with the heightened attentiveness of someone who has been using sound as his only available source of information for several hours. He could feel the character of the road changing under the wheels, a subtle textural change that meant something or nothing depending on what it was. And then, either from the sounds above him or from some communication through the boot's surface whose mechanism is difficult to reconstruct precisely, he understood that they were through. The accounts of what happened in the moments after the crossing vary slightly in their specific details, with some describing a stop shortly after the border to allow him out of the boot, others suggesting the transfer happened somewhat further along the Finnish road. What all accounts agree on is that he emerged from the boot of the car into Finland, into air that was the same oxygen and nitrogen and trace elements as the air on the other side had been, but that felt completely different because the state whose authority extended over the air on the other side did not extend to where he was standing now. He was in Finland. He was outside the reach of the KGB and the Soviet legal apparatus and the specific counterintelligence machinery that had been, for the preceding weeks, slowly and patiently closing in on him. He was free. The emotional register of the moment, described by Gordievsky with the careful emotional modulation that characterizes his accounts throughout his memoir, was not simply relief. Relief was certainly present, certainly the dominant physical sensation of a man who had been in a car boot for several hours under conditions of sustained and genuine physical and psychological stress. But the moment was also marked by something more complex, by the full weight of what he had left behind and what he would now never be able to return to. His daughters were in Moscow. They were very young. He had not said goodbye to them. He could not say goodbye because doing so would have required a conversation whose content would have revealed the plan and whose revelation would have been catastrophic for the plan. He had left while they were still sleeping, as fathers sometimes do when they have early appointments, in a manner that was entirely consistent with a man who expected to be back that evening. He would not be back that evening. He would not be back for years. His daughters and his wife were Soviet citizens with no particular reason to believe that any power outside the Soviet Union could or would protect them, and the Soviet state's response to his escape would include various forms of pressure on the family he had left behind. This was the cost, and he had calculated it in advance, not coldly, not without feeling, but comprehensively, in the way that people who make large, irrevocable decisions necessarily must, by arriving at an understanding of what they are choosing and what that choosing excludes. The British team moved efficiently in the aftermath of the crossing. The intelligence about what had just happened needed to reach London, and the operational security of everyone involved needed to be managed in the hours and days that would follow once Moscow discovered that Gordievsky was gone. He was transported north through Finland in a vehicle convoy that moved with purpose, the operational phase not fully complete until geographic distance from the Soviet border had been established and alternate extraction routes secured against any Soviet diplomatic or operational response. He arrived at a location where SIS personnel could brief him safely, where the debrief process could begin, where the essential professional relationship between Sunbeam and the people who had run and protected him across more than a decade could be resumed in conditions that were no longer defined by danger. In London, The notification that Pimlico had been successful reached the relevant people through the secure channels of the intelligence service with the weight that such a communication carries when the people receiving it have spent years building the operation that has just delivered its most critical outcome. Senior SIS officials had been in a state of heightened attention since the signal activation, and the confirmation that the extraction had worked brought with it, by accounts from people who were present in the operational environment during those hours, a quality of feeling that went beyond professional satisfaction, touching the more personal dimensions of what it means to have kept faith with a man who had taken an extraordinary risk on the basis of a relationship of trust. Gordievsky was flown to Britain. He arrived in a country that was, in the most practical and legal sense, now his home by permanent necessity as well as long-standing personal affinity. He arrived without his family, without his daughters, without the ordinary human accompaniments that make coming to a place feel like an arrival rather than a displacement. He arrived in possession of everything he knew, everything he had observed and filed and analyzed across 15 years of double agency inside one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence organizations, and he arrived with the understanding that the telling of all that knowledge, the extended debrief that would occupy the weeks and months ahead, was the final act of the professional career whose extraordinary arc had brought him here. The immediate challenge was to debrief him before the intelligence he carried began to soften at the edges of recall, before the specific details of operations and personnel and priorities that had accumulated across his years of service to British intelligence began the inevitable process of fading that time imposes on even the most disciplined and retentive memory. The SIS teams who worked with him on the debrief were engaged in a process of enormous intelligence significance, extracting from his comprehensive knowledge of the KGB's operations, methods, and strategic thinking a body of material whose processing and analysis would occupy the intelligence community for months. The Soviet Union had not yet formally reacted. Moscow's discovery that Gordievsky was gone, and that he was gone in British diplomatic custody, was coming, and the repercussions of that discovery would be severe. But on this July evening, in a country that had made space for a man who had gambled everything, the immediate accounting was not political but deeply personal. A man who had left his children in a Moscow apartment was breathing English air for what he understood might be forever. The Soviet government did not discover immediately that Gordievsky had left. The mechanics of this delay are themselves instructive about the nature and limitations of even the most comprehensive surveillance apparatus. He had told no one he was leaving. He had maintained his apartment, his routines, his outward patterns of behavior up to the final morning, and the absence of visible preparation meant that when he did not appear for his expected obligations on July 19th, the initial institutional assumption was that he was simply late or unwell, or pursuing some personal errand that had taken longer than expected. It was not until the absence extended beyond the period of plausible domestic explanation that the KGB's internal machinery began to register alarm, and it was not until that alarm had been acted upon, and the specific circumstances of his disappearance investigated, that the general shape of what had happened became clear to Moscow Center. What made full clarity initially elusive was the absence of any obvious mechanism for his departure. He had not flown out of any Soviet airport on record. He had not crossed any land border under his own documentation. He had simply stopped being in Moscow, and the specific answer to how this had been accomplished required the KGB's investigators to work through the possibilities available to a man in his circumstances until they arrived at the one that fit the evidence. The diplomatic vehicle exemption was not, as a category of possibility, something the Soviet security apparatus was unaware of. It was, after all, their own system, and while it had been maintained because the diplomatic conventions it rested on served Soviet purposes in foreign countries as well as creating vulnerabilities at home, the particular use that had been made of it in this instance had to be reconstructed from the available evidence rather than observed in real time. The Soviet government's formal response, once the reconstruction was complete and the facts were established beyond denying, came through the official diplomatic channels that governed relationships between states with complex and often hostile intelligence relationships. The British embassy in Moscow received a formal protest. The Soviet Foreign Ministry summoned the British ambassador. The diplomatic language was controlled, as diplomatic language in matters of espionage generally is even when the underlying reality is one of institutional fury, because both sides understood that the public management of intelligence failures is itself an intelligence and diplomatic operation with its own rules and objectives. The substantive response was less controlled. On September 12, 1985, the Soviet Union presented the British government with a list of individuals declared persona non grata, the diplomatic term for intelligence officers whose cover has been blown and who are being formally expelled from the host country. The list included 25 people, a number that represented an unprecedented mass expulsion of British diplomatic personnel from the Soviet Union and a measure of the genuine institutional anger that Moscow's discovery of Gordievsky's escape and what it implied about the SIS's extraordinary penetration of the London KGB station had generated. The British government's response was to expel a corresponding number of Soviet diplomats from London, and the resulting bilateral damage to the diplomatic relationship persisted for a considerable period. The KGB conducted its own internal investigation with the thoroughness that an operation of this magnitude required. The investigation was motivated not only by the institutional need to understand what had happened but by the intelligence damage assessment requirement, the need to determine what Sunbeam had known and therefore what had been compromised across the years of his double career. The scope of that damage assessment was, by any institutional measure, staggering. Gordievsky had served as a KGB officer for more than 2 decades. He had been passing intelligence to the British for more than a decade of that period, from Copenhagen through the Moscow years and through the entirety of his London posting. He had been, for several years, the acting head of the KGB's most important Western station. The question of what he had known in each of those roles, and therefore what the British and their American partners had known through him, was an exercise in institutional archaeology that produced conclusions whose scale and significance were profoundly uncomfortable for the KGB and for the Kremlin. The identities of KGB officers whose cover had never been publicly blown were likely compromised. The specific details of operations against British and Western targets across a decade were known to the other side. The strategic intelligence Gordievsky had provided about Soviet thinking, about Operation Ryan, about Able Archer, about Gorbachev and the Politburo, had shaped Western policy responses in ways that the Soviet intelligence analysts reviewing the record could now trace forward from their own side and assess. The picture that emerged from this trace was not a comfortable one, and the institutional response to it included a major reorganization of KGB operations in the United Kingdom and a systematic review of operations elsewhere that might have been compromised through the intelligence sharing arrangements that distributed Sunbeam's product to Allied services. Gordievsky himself was tried in absentia by a Soviet military court and convicted of treason. The conviction carried a sentence of death under Soviet law, the standard penalty for the specific offense of providing state secrets to a foreign intelligence service. The sentence could not be enforced while he remained outside the Soviet Union's jurisdiction, but it was understood by all parties as a formal statement of the Soviet government's permanent institutional position on what he had done and what they believed he deserved. He would remain, in Soviet and subsequently Russian law, a convicted traitor subject to the death penalty, though the practical application of Soviet justice in absentia required an entirely different kind of mechanism from a conviction in a functioning court, and the possibility that it would be enforced through an intelligence operation against him in the United Kingdom was understood and managed by the SIS accordingly. The debrief that the SIS conducted with Gordievsky in the weeks and months following his extraction was, by the assessments of those involved, one of the most extensive and significant intelligence debriefs in British intelligence history. He had a comprehensive memory, trained by years of professional intelligence work to retain and organize large volumes of specific information, and he brought to the debrief sessions the systematic precision that had characterized everything else he had done professionally. The material he provided covered KGB personnel and operations across the entire scope of his career, filled in significant gaps in Western intelligence about Soviet activities in multiple countries, and produced a body of specific intelligence whose processing generated operational benefits for the SIS and its partners for years after his departure from the Soviet Union. His wife and daughters remained in Moscow. This was the personal cost of the extraction, the unavoidable price that the operational imperatives of the escape had imposed on the people closest to him, and it was a cost whose weight was immediately and continuously present in the period following his arrival in Britain. The Soviet authorities, following their management of other cases where intelligence officers had defected or been extracted and family members remained on Soviet territory, placed restrictions on the family's movements and activities, denied Layla permission to travel, subjected the family to the specific institutional harassment that expressed the state's displeasure without, in this case, extending to formal prosecution. Gordievsky and the British government worked consistently to apply diplomatic pressure through available channels, and the question of when and whether his family might be permitted to leave remained unresolved through the late 1980s as the Soviet Union entered the turbulent period of Gorbachev's reforms. In October 1990, with the Soviet political structure under the combined pressures of glasnost, perestroika, and the accelerating unraveling of the Eastern European satellite system that had reached its most dramatic phase in 1989, Layla and the two daughters, Maria and Anna, were finally permitted to leave the Soviet Union and travel to Britain. The reunion, nearly 5.5 years after Gordievsky had left Moscow in the boot of a car, was not the simple resolution that the word reunion suggests. The years of separation had changed everyone involved. The daughters had grown through significant portions of their childhoods without their father. Layla had managed the specific difficulty of being the wife of a convicted traitor in a society that attached severe social and institutional consequences to that designation. The family that assembled in England in late 1990 was the same family, connected by the irreducible ties that families are connected by, but the intervening years had left their own form of mark. Gordievsky began the next phase of his life in Britain, the phase that was also, in certain concrete ways, the phase in which the significance of what he had done across the preceding decades became more fully visible to the public. He collaborated with the historian Christopher Andrew on a major intelligence history of the KGB, drawing on his knowledge and on newly available archival material to produce a volume that remains one of the most authoritative accounts of Soviet intelligence history available to scholars. He published his own memoir, Next Stop Execution, in 1995, which provided a detailed and candid account of his life and career and of the specific circumstances of his extraction, told in a voice that combined the precision of a professional intelligence officer with the reflectiveness of a man who has lived with the consequences of extraordinary choices for long enough to have developed a complex relationship with his own story. He lectured. He consulted with governments and intelligence services. He became, in the years after the Cold War ended, a figure whose specific expertise in the nature and methods of Soviet intelligence was in continuing demand from people trying to understand what the Cold War had been and how its various institutions had functioned. He received formal recognition from the British government for his service, and was appointed a Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, a decoration whose formal significance was accompanied by the more practical significance of official acknowledgement of what he had contributed. He has lived since his arrival in Britain at a protected location, with a degree of anonymity about his precise whereabouts that reflects a realistic assessment of the continuing institutional attitude of the Russian state toward the man its courts had sentenced to death. The FSB, the successor to the KGB, is not, in matters of this kind, an organization that maintains a purely historical perspective on the past, and the various Russian intelligence operations against dissenters and former intelligence officers that have taken place on British soil in the decades since the end of the Cold War serve as reminder that the institutional positions of states toward those they regard as traitors do not automatically expire with changes of political management at the top. Gordievsky has been aware of this throughout his British years without allowing it to constrain the public engagement with his story that he has chosen to maintain. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991. The state whose secrets he had spent 15 years protecting and then systematically disclosing, the state that had trained him and employed him and attempted to use pharmacological interrogation to recover the truth it already half knew, collapsed under the accumulated weight of its own contradictions, the economic failure and the political delegitimization and the simple exhaustion of a system that had for too long demanded from its citizens a performance of belief that the underlying reality could no longer sustain. The irony of a man who had given his adult professional life to the service and then the subversion of a state watching that state's disintegration from the safety of the country he had helped to protect against it is not subtle, and Gordievsky has addressed it in various forms over the years with the characteristic mixture of precision and feeling that marks his public accounts of his own life. He had been right. He had concluded, on the evidence available to him across the years from 1968, that the Soviet project was indefensible, that the system built in its name could not survive indefinitely because it was not built on anything that human beings could genuinely need from a political arrangement, and that the most meaningful thing a person in his specific position could do about this conclusion was to act on it in the only way available to him. The Soviet Union's collapse did not prove him right in some formal logical sense, because historical events do not operate as proofs of individual moral judgments. But it did provide a particular kind of retrospective coherence to a life whose most defining choices had been made on the basis of exactly that conviction. In the years since his extraction from Moscow, Gordievsky has returned repeatedly in interviews and public reflections to the question of what his double life meant, not in the abstract political sense of what contribution the intelligence he provided made to the Cold War's outcome, but in the more intimate sense of what it meant to be the specific person who made the specific choices he made across the specific years in which he made them. This is a different question from the intelligence analyst's question about strategic impact, and it has a different kind of answer, one that resists the clean resolution that strategic assessments allow and that carries instead the necessary incompleteness of a life examined from within. What he has argued consistently, and what the historical record broadly supports, is that the intelligence he produced during his years as Sunbeam changed specific things in the world that would not have been changed otherwise. The most significant of these, in his own assessment and in the assessment of the intelligence historians and officers who have examined the record with detailed access, is the contribution his reporting made to the Western understanding of the Able Archer 83 crisis and to the modification of Reagan's strategic rhetoric that followed from that understanding. The argument is not that Gordievsky single-handedly prevented nuclear war, a claim whose grandiosity would be difficult to sustain and whose mechanism would be impossible to trace with precision. The argument is the more modest and more defensible one that his intelligence materially contributed to a shift in American presidential thinking about Soviet intentions and fears that reduced the temperature at a moment when the temperature was dangerously high, and that this contribution was causally significant in a way that it would not have been had nobody been providing the specific insight into Soviet strategic anxiety that he alone was positioned to provide. The operational damage his extraction and subsequent disclosures inflicted on Soviet intelligence was extensive and has been documented with increasing completeness as the relevant archives have become partially accessible and as the principal participants have produced their accounts. The London KGB station's operations were severely disrupted by the combination of Gordievsky's departure, the intelligence he subsequently provided, and the mass expulsion of September 1985 that physically removed much of the station's personnel. The British security services used what they had learned from Sunbeam to improve their own defenses against Soviet intelligence penetration across multiple institutional domains, filling in the picture of KGB tradecraft and priority targets with a completeness that years of conventional counterintelligence work had not produced. The Americans, through the intelligence-sharing relationship that had distributed Sunbeam's product throughout the period of his active double career, similarly benefited from the debrief material in ways that are reflected in the improved effectiveness of Western intelligence assessment in the period immediately following his arrival in Britain. The Aldrich Ames case continued for another 9 years after Gordievsky's escape. Ames went on providing the Soviet and then Russian intelligence service with information about CIA sources and methods from 1985 until his arrest in February 1994, during which time he is estimated to have compromised well over 100 CIA operations and to have been responsible, directly or indirectly, for the deaths of at least 10 people who were working for Western intelligence. The full scope of the Ames damage remained unknown for years after Gordievsky's extraction, because the CIA's internal investigation of how its Soviet sources had been compromised in 1985 initially pointed toward technical explanations for the losses rather than toward a human source within the organization, and the systematic review that would eventually identify Ames did not produce its decisive results until the early 1990s. Gordievsky's debriefings, according to accounts from intelligence officials involved in the process, were among the inputs that contributed over time to the understanding that a CIA mole must exist, though the specific identification of Ames required domestic investigative work that fell outside the scope of what any external source could provide. Ames was arrested in February 1994 and pleaded guilty to charges of espionage and conspiracy. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, the maximum available under American law for the specific offenses to which he admitted. His wife Rosario, whose knowledge of his activities was established during the investigation, also pleaded guilty to related charges and received a reduced sentence. The prosecution's presentation of the damage Ames had caused included specific reference to the lives lost as a result of his disclosures, and the impact of his betrayal was described in terms that conveyed, with appropriate gravity, the specific human cost of the most damaging intelligence failure in CIA history. Gordievsky was not among the casualties, but this was entirely a function of the British intelligence service's operational competence and planning, not of any oversight or hesitation by Ames or by the KGB that acted on his disclosures. The intelligence community has, in the years since 1985 and with considerable acceleration after Gordievsky began publishing his accounts, developed a substantial body of analysis and reflection about what the Sunbeam case represents in terms of the practice and the ethics of intelligence. The ethical dimension is not normally a prominent area of public discussion within intelligence services, which tend to evaluate their operations primarily by the operational assessment categories of success and failure, access and coverage, intelligence value, and damage. But the Gordievsky case has attracted ethical reflection in part because of who he was, an individual who made a genuinely autonomous moral choice on the basis of genuine moral conviction, whose motivations were not primarily financial or personal but ideological in the deepest sense, rooted in a private assessment of what a political system required its officers to do in its service and whether that requirement was one a person of conscience could accept as legitimate. His case is sometimes compared to that of other significant Cold War defectors and penetrations, and the comparisons are instructive for what they reveal about the diversity of the category. Some Cold War intelligence penetrations were motivated primarily by money. Some were motivated by personal grievance, ideology, romantic entanglement, blackmail, career grievance, or some combination of these factors. Gordievsky's motivation was, by all available accounts including his own, primarily one of genuine political conviction, a conviction that had developed across years of specific experience in a society whose lived reality he had eventually found irreconcilable with its proclaimed values. This did not make his contribution more valuable in a purely operational sense, since the intelligence world evaluates its sources by what they produce rather than by how they came to produce it, but it gives his case a particular quality of moral clarity that distinguishes it from those where the motivational picture is more complex and less creditable. There is a biographical context that Gordievsky has returned to in his public reflections that is worth dwelling on, because it concerns the specific relationship between his double career and the question of what constitutes loyalty. He was, from one perspective, the most disloyal Soviet my career imaginable, a man who had been born into an NKVD household, who had been trained at the state's expense in the state's most elite intelligence institution, who had been trusted with the state's most sensitive foreign intelligence operations, and who had, from a position of that trust, spent a decade and a half feeding the state's most important secrets to its principal adversary. Soviet law, Soviet institutional culture, Soviet political philosophy, and Soviet moral discourse all had very clear and consistent things to say about this specific category of conduct. His own view of the matter was different, and it was a view he held not as a rationalization but as the result of extended serious thought about what loyalty actually requires and what it does not. He was loyal, he would argue, not to any institutional embodiment of Soviet power but to the values that the Soviet Union had claimed to represent and had consistently betrayed in practice. He was loyal to the people of the Soviet Union, whom the system served inadequately and at enormous cost. He was loyal to the human beings on both sides of the Cold War divide whose best prospect for surviving the period without nuclear catastrophe depended on the Western alliance having accurate intelligence about Soviet intentions and capabilities, including the specific intelligence about Soviet strategic anxiety that allowed Western leaders to calibrate their responses more carefully than they would otherwise have done. And he was loyal to a vision of human political life in which states governed by consent rather than coercion were not simply preferable but were, in some sense that his long experience on both sides of the divide had made vivid to him, more genuinely consistent with what human beings actually need from political arrangements. Whether this argument is persuasive depends significantly on where you start and what you already believe about the relationship between institutional loyalty and moral obligation, and there are reasonable positions available on questions of that kind that would not lead to the conclusion Gordievsky reached. What is not in any reasonable dispute is that the choice he made was a genuine choice, made by a person capable of making different choices, under circumstances where the personal cost of the specific choice he made was extraordinary, and sustained across decades with a discipline and a consistency that are their own form of testimony to where the genuine weight of his convictions lay. He lives in Britain this day, under the protected arrangements that have been in place since his arrival in July 1985, and the world around him has changed almost beyond recognition from the world in which his extraordinary double career was conducted. The Soviet Union he served and subverted is gone. The KGB, whose internal workings he mapped so comprehensively for British intelligence, has been reconstituted in a different institutional form under a different name, but the FSB and SVR that succeeded it maintain a relationship to the past whose institutional continuity is real enough that the personal safety questions that surrounded Gordievsky's British years have not become merely historical. He has continued to speak and write and consult with the specific authority of someone who saw the machinery of Soviet intelligence from the inside, at both working and command levels, across a period that shaped the modern world in ways that are still fully being understood. The man who left his Moscow apartment on a July morning in running clothes, who was driven across a continent hiding in a car boot, who emerged onto Finnish soil having left behind everything he had known and most of the people he loved, is a figure about whom the word extraordinary seems, for once, not an inflation but an accurate assessment. The stretch of life that preceded that morning was extraordinary. The nerve and the planning and the controlled fear that made the morning itself possible were extraordinary. And the contribution to the specific historical moment in which it all took place, to the period of maximum Cold War danger through which the world passed without destroying itself, was extraordinary in a way that the intelligence historians who have examined it with the most careful attention have been consistent in their assessment of. He asked nothing of the world in return for what he did. He did not negotiate a comfortable extraction before providing his intelligence. He did not demand guarantees or financial arrangements commensurate with what he was risking. He decided, on the basis of a private moral calculation conducted across years, that it was right to act, and then he acted, and the acting was everything. The foil blanket is long gone, the Volvo long since scrapped, the specific stretch of Finnish road long since pressed under the ordinary traffic of subsequent decades. But the intelligence he passed, the understanding he made possible, the careful diplomatic adjustments that his reporting contributed to, the lives that were not ended because a man on a Moscow morning decided that something mattered enough to justify the car boot, those things are still present in the world, dispersed through the historical record of a period when the distance between ordinary and catastrophic was smaller than anyone who did not know what Gordievsky knew could fully appreciate.